9,000 years. Sit with that number for a second. Not 900 years, not even 9 centuries. 9,000 years before a Greek lawmaker named Solon ever set foot in Egypt. Priests in a temple supposedly told him about a war, a lost civilization, and a catastrophe that swallowed an entire island. That's according to Plato, writing this story down roughly 300 years after Solon supposedly heard it. And that gap alone should make you suspicious. But the number itself, 9,000 years, is where things get genuinely strange. Think about what existed 9,000 years before Solon. Solon lived around 600 BCE, so we're talking about events happening around 9,600 BCE. That's before the pyramids, before writing, before agriculture had even fully taken hold in most of the world. That's deep into the last ice age, right, as glaciers were retreating and the world was reshaping itself. If Egyptian priests really preserved a memory that old, that's not just impressive. That's almost impossible by everything we understand about how information survives across generations. So here's the question that's going to drive everything in this investigation. What did the priests of Egypt actually tell Solon? Not what popular culture has turned it into. Not the Hollywood version with crystal technology and sunken cities glowing under the sea. What does Plato's actual text say? Where does this story come from historically? And is there any chance at all that something real is buried underneath one of the most famous myths in Western history? Because here's the thing people forget. Atlantis isn't some standalone legend that's existed forever in the collective imagination. It comes from exactly 2 sources, 2 dialogues written by one philosopher, Plato, in the 4th century BCE. Everything else, every documentary, every conspiracy theory, every book claiming to have found Atlantis off the coast of wherever, all of it traces back to these 2 texts. And within those texts, the entire foundation rests on this claim that Egyptian priests at a temple in a city called Sais handed down knowledge stretching back thousands of years, knowledge the Greeks themselves had completely forgotten. So that's what we're doing today. We're going back to the actual source. We're going to look at what Plato wrote, word for word, about this supposed conversation. We're going to trace the chain of people this story passed through before it ever reached Plato's pen. We're going to examine what we actually know about Egyptian record-keeping, about their concept of time, about whether a civilization could realistically preserve a memory across 9 millennia. And we're going to look at the theories, including one that might completely change how you read that number 9,000 in the first place. This isn't about proving Atlantis was real or fake. This is about understanding what the ancient world actually believed about its own deep past, and why an Egyptian priest, according to Plato, looked at a Greek visitor and essentially called him a child who knew nothing. Before we get into it, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is right there. I check the comments constantly, and there's something genuinely fascinating about knowing this is playing at breakfast in Athens while someone else has it on at midnight in Cairo. History connects us in strange ways, and so does whatever app you're using right now. So drop a comment. Tell me your city and the time. It's one of my favourite parts of putting these together. And if you want to support what we're doing here, the best way is simple. Follow the show on Spotify, listen there when you can, and if you're enjoying the deep dives, leave a 5-star review. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and the link is right there in the description. Now, let's get into where this story actually comes from, and why one Greek family had anything to do with it at all. So let's start with the basics, the stuff that gets skipped over constantly in documentaries and clickbait videos. Where does the Atlantis story actually live? Not in some ancient Egyptian scroll. Not in a lost library. Not in hieroglyphics carved into a temple wall somewhere in the Nile Delta. It lives in exactly 2 texts, both written by the same person, both written in Greek, both written roughly 300 years after the events they claim to describe supposedly happened, at least according to the internal chronology of the story itself. Those two texts are called Timaeus and Critias. They're dialogues, which is the format Plato used for basically everything he wrote. And if you're not familiar with what a Platonic dialogue actually is, this matters more than you might think for understanding what we're dealing with here. A dialogue isn't a historical record. It isn't a chronicle. It isn't Plato sitting down and writing, "Here's what happened. Here are the facts. Trust me." A dialogue is a conversation between characters, sometimes real historical figures, sometimes composites, sometimes probably invented entirely, and Plato uses these conversations to explore philosophical ideas. The most famous character in almost all of these dialogues is Socrates, Plato's teacher, who spends most of his time asking pointed questions and making everyone else look a little foolish. That's the format: question, answer, debate, philosophical exploration, wrapped in the structure of people talking to each other. So when we say Plato wrote about Atlantis, what we actually mean is Plato wrote a scene where a character describes Atlantis to other characters. And that distinction is not a minor technicality. It's the whole ballgame. Timaeus is the dialogue that opens the story. It's mostly concerned with cosmology, the nature of the universe, how the world was constructed by a divine craftsman, incredibly dense philosophical material about physics and metaphysics that most people skip over entirely to get to the Atlantis part. And that's understandable. But here's the thing. The Atlantis material shows up almost like a preface, a warm-up act before the main philosophical event. It's brief. It's a summary. It's basically a trailer for a much longer story that Plato apparently intended to tell in full detail somewhere else. That somewhere else is Critias, the second dialogue, named after the character who does most of the talking. And this is where things get interesting, because Critias is where the detailed version of the Atlantis story is supposed to unfold. The geography, the political structure, the war, the destruction, all the details that made Atlantis famous. Except there's a problem, a big one. The dialogue is unfinished. Plato never completed it. It just stops, mid-sentence essentially, right as Zeus is about to deliver some kind of judgment on Atlantis for its moral corruption. We never get the climax. We never get the full account of the war or the flood in complete detail. What we have is a fragment, a torn-off piece of a much larger story that either Plato never finished writing, or finished and the ending was lost, or maybe never intended to finish at all. Nobody knows for certain, and that uncertainty alone should tell you something about how carefully we need to handle this material. Now, who is this character Critias, and why does he matter so much to this whole investigation? Critias, within the dialogue, is presented as an elderly Athenian who heard the Atlantis story as a child from his grandfather, who was also named Critias, who in turn heard it directly from a man named Solon. Solon, as we mentioned before, was a real historical figure, a lawmaker and poet who lived around 600 BCE and was famous for reforming Athenian law. According to the character Critias, Solon travelled to Egypt, visited a city called Sais, spoke with priests there, and came back with a story about a lost civilization called Atlantis, and an ancient, forgotten version of Athens that had fought against it 9,000 years earlier. So the character Critias is essentially our narrator for the entire legend. Everything we know about the Egyptian priests, everything we know about what they supposedly told Solon, comes through this character's mouth, inside a philosophical dialogue written by Plato, generations after any of this supposedly happened. That's 4 layers of transmission before the story even gets fixed in writing. The priests to Solon, Solon to the elder Critias to his grandson, the grandson to Plato's dialogue. 4 hops at minimum, and that's assuming every single link in that chain repeated the story accurately, without embellishment, without simplification, without the kind of drift that happens every single time information passes from one person to another across generations. And here's where I want to slow down, because this is the point people miss constantly when they treat Atlantis like an established historical claim, rather than a story embedded inside a piece of philosophical literature. Just because a character in Plato's dialogue says something doesn't mean Plato is asserting it as literal historical fact. Characters in dialogues make claims constantly that Plato clearly intends the reader to question, challenge, or interpret symbolically. That's the entire structure of how these texts work. Socrates himself, in dialogue after dialogue, gets other characters to make bold claims specifically so he can dismantle them piece by piece. Reading a claim inside a Platonic dialogue and immediately treating it as Plato's personal historical assertion is a little like watching a debate on stage and assuming every line spoken by every actor reflects the exact beliefs of the playwright. Sometimes it does, sometimes it's the opposite, sometimes it's somewhere murky in between, and figuring out which is exactly the kind of puzzle scholars have been arguing over for literally thousands of years. So does that mean the Atlantis story is definitely fiction, invented wholesale by Plato, purely to illustrate a philosophical point? Not necessarily. Plato does something unusual with this particular story that he doesn't typically do with other illustrative myths in his other dialogues. He goes out of his way repeatedly, within the text itself, to insist that this story is true. Not a parable, not an allegory, but an actual historical account passed down through a specific, named chain of real people. That insistence is unusual enough that some scholars take it seriously as evidence. Plato believed he was drawing on some kind of genuine tradition, even if it had been exaggerated or distorted along the way. Other scholars think the insistence itself is a literary device, a way of making a philosophical thought experiment feel more grounded and urgent by dressing it up in the costume of history. We'll dig much deeper into that tension later, because it's really the central question of this entire investigation. But here's what we can say clearly right now without controversy. There is no surviving Egyptian document, no papyrus, no temple inscription, no independent Greek source outside of Plato's own circle that tells this story on its own. Egypt has left us an enormous amount of written material. Religious texts, administrative records, king lists, funerary inscriptions, personal letters. Egyptologists have spent 2 centuries digging through this material, and nowhere in it, not once, does an independent Egyptian source mention Atlantis, mention a war against an island empire beyond the Pillars of Heracles, or mention an ancient forgotten Athens that fought valiantly against it. Everything we know about this story exists exclusively because Plato wrote it down. That doesn't automatically make it false. Silence in the historical record isn't proof of nothing happening. But it does mean we're working with a single source, filtered through multiple layers of oral transmission, embedded inside a work of philosophy, with no independent Egyptian confirmation whatsoever. Which brings us to something that sounds almost too obvious to say out loud, but genuinely gets skipped constantly, even by people making entire documentaries about Atlantis. Before we can judge whether this story holds any historical value, whether there's a kernel of real memory buried inside it, we actually have to look at what the text says, word for word, not the popularized version, not the version filtered through centuries of occultists, treasure hunters and pseudo-historians who added crystal cities and advanced technology that appear absolutely nowhere in Plato's original writing. The actual passage as Plato wrote it describing the meeting between Solon and the priests of Sais. So that's exactly what we're going to do next. We're going to trace this chain of transmission, person by person, starting with the man at the very centre of it, an Athenian lawmaker who probably had no idea his trip to Egypt would end up fueling arguments about a lost civilization more than 2,000 years later. The first link is Egypt, more specifically the city of Sais in the western Nile Delta. According to Critias, Solon went there during his travels and spoke with priests at the temple of Neith, the city's patron goddess. Neith was not some obscure local deity. The Greeks identified her with Athena, which is already doing important work inside Plato's story. It creates a bridge between Athens and Sais, same goddess, different names. Two ancient cities supposedly connected by a shared divine origin. And then Critias says the priests told Solon something astonishing. They said the Greeks remembered only the most recent disasters. They remembered a few floods, a few ancient kings, fragments of their own past. But Egypt, protected by the regular cycles of the Nile, and preserved through priestly records, remembered much more. They remembered an Athens older than the Athens Solon knew, an Athens that had existed thousands of years before, an Athens that had stood against a vast empire from beyond the pillars of Heracles. That empire was Atlantis. Now, stop there, because even at this earliest stage, we're not listening directly to Egyptian priests. We are listening to Plato's version of Critias's version of what Solon supposedly heard from them. The priests do not speak in their own surviving words. There is no Egyptian transcription of the conversation, no temple record saying, "On this day, an Athenian visitor named Solon was informed about an island empire that sank beneath the sea." The Egyptian priest is a voice inside a Greek philosophical dialogue, and that matters. But Plato does not present this as a random campfire story. He builds a chain, a very deliberate chain. Each person has a name. Each link is supposed to make the next one feel more credible. The story begins in the archives of Egypt, passes to one of Athens' most famous lawmakers, enters a respected aristocratic family, survives in memory across generations, and finally reaches the reader through Plato. It is like Plato is saying, don't treat this as hearsay. Here is the root. Here are the hands it passed through. Here is how an impossible story crossed 9,000 years, 2 civilizations and several generations of Athenians. First, the priests of Sais tell Solon. Then Solon brings the account back to Athens. And according to Critias, Solon did not just casually mention it once at a dinner party and move on. He intended to turn it into poetry. This is one of the strangest details in the whole transmission story. Solon was not only a politician and lawgiver, he was also a poet. In archaic Greece, poetry was not just entertainment. It was one of the main technologies for preserving memory. Laws could be written in verse. Moral teachings could be written in verse. Family achievements, wars, genealogies, all of it could be shaped into language built to survive repetition. Rhythm helps memory. Meter helps memory. A good line can outlive the person who first spoke it by centuries. Critias says Solon began composing the Atlantis story in poetic form after returning from Egypt. He even quotes what he claims were the opening words of Solon's unfinished poem. But Solon, according to the dialogue, was too busy. Political turmoil, public responsibilities, the demands of reforming Athens. He never completed the work. Think about the implication. The greatest lost civilization in human history, if the story is true, nearly became an Athenian epic. Not a secret priestly text, not a coded prophecy, a poem, something meant to be recited, remembered, and shared. But it remained unfinished, and then it passed into the family of a man named Dropides. Dropides is easy to overlook because he barely appears as a character, but in the chain he is crucial. Critias describes him as Solon's relative and close friend. Solon supposedly gave him the material, or at least told him the story, and left behind notes or unfinished verses. From Dropides the account became part of a family inheritance. Not necessarily a formal archive. Not necessarily a scroll locked in a chest with an official seal. More likely, if we follow the dialogue's own logic, it became something preserved through elite family memory. A story about Athens before Athens. A story that made the family of Dropides custodians of a national secret. And that is where the next Critias enters. The character telling the story in Plato's dialogue is called Critias. But he says he first heard it from his grandfather, who was also called Critias. Yes, the names get confusing. Plato is dealing with an actual Athenian family in which names repeated across generations, like a family where every other man is named John or William, and eventually nobody can remember which one fought in which war. The elder Critias, the grandfather, had supposedly learned the story from Dropides' family circle, where Solon's account had been preserved. Then, when the younger Critias was a boy, about 10 years old by his own recollection, his grandfather told it to him during a festival. The old man was around 90, and that detail feels almost cinematic. An elderly aristocrat, near the end of his life, telling a child about a forgotten war from the deep past. A story of ancient Athens, ancient Egypt, and a vanished empire. The boy listens. The story stays with him for decades. Then, as an old man himself, he retells it before Socrates and the others. That is the chain Plato gives us. Priests of Sais, Solon, Dropides, elder Critias, younger Critias, Plato's dialogue, and every link raises questions because oral transmission is powerful. Much more powerful than modern people sometimes assume. Before widespread literacy, entire societies preserved laws, genealogies, religious ceremonies, land boundaries, and epic histories through speech. The Homeric poems were shaped in oral tradition long before they were fixed in writing. Ancient people trained memory in ways most of us simply do not. A skilled performer could hold thousands and thousands of lines in the mind. So the idea that a story could survive for a few generations within an elite Athenian family is not ridiculous. It is entirely possible, but preserving the broad shape of a story is not the same thing as preserving every detail exactly. Anyone who has heard a family story repeated by grandparents knows how this works. The central event may be real. Your great-grandfather crossed an ocean. Your aunt survived a fire. Someone lost everything in a war. But the details shift. Dates blur. Motives become cleaner. Heroes become braver. Enemies become worse. One person's quick decision becomes a legendary act of courage by the third retelling. Now multiply that problem across cultures. An Egyptian priest speaks to a Greek visitor. The conversation may have required interpreters, unless Solon knew enough Egyptian, which we cannot establish. Egyptian religious concepts get translated into Greek equivalents. Names change, dates are converted, political institutions are described in categories Greeks can understand. Then Solon turns the material into Greek poetry. Then a family preserves it orally. Then an old man tells a child. Then, decades later, that child recounts it in Plato's dialogue. This is not a clean pipeline from ancient Egypt to modern readers. It is more like water passing through layers of rock. Something may travel all the way through, but it picks up minerals along the way. Its shape changes, its taste changes, and Plato knows that. Or at least he wants us to know that he knows it. The chain makes the story feel old, inherited, and serious. But it also gives Plato room to operate. If details seem Greek, if ancient Athens starts looking suspiciously like Plato's ideal city, if Atlantis begins resembling a warning about the corruption of wealthy imperial powers, Plato can place those features inside the inherited tale. He is not necessarily saying, "I invented this." He is saying, "This is what Critias received." That is a brilliant literary strategy. it gives Atlantis two identities at once. On one level, it is presented as inherited memory, a story with name transmitters, family connections, and an Egyptian source. On another level, it is a carefully constructed philosophical narrative designed to put Athens and Atlantis into moral contrast. The chain does not prove the story happened, but it explains why Plato wanted his audience to feel that it might have happened. And the most important voice in that chain, the one that gives the story its terrifying age, is still waiting for us in Sais. Because before the priest tells Solon about Atlantis, he does something else first. He rebukes the Greeks. "O Solon, Solon, you Greeks are always children." That is the line. It is one of the most famous insults in ancient literature, and it comes just before the Atlantis story begins. Not from an enemy of Greece, not from a barbarian king trying to humiliate Athens, from an Egyptian priest speaking to one of Athens's most respected lawmakers. And the insult is more devastating than it first sounds. The priest does not mean that Greeks are childish in the ordinary sense. He does not mean they are foolish, weak, or incapable. In fact, Plato's Greeks were intensely proud of their intelligence. They had philosophy, mathematics, poetry, political debate, drama, astronomy. They had Homer. They had the great cities of the Aegean. They had stories reaching back to gods and heroes. But in the priest's eyes, none of that made them old. Because being old in this context does not mean having lots of elderly people. It means possessing deep memory. It means knowing what happened before the last disaster, before the last migration, before the last collapse. It means having institutions strong enough to keep records when generations die, cities burn, and whole populations are thrown back into survival mode. The priest tells Solon that the Greeks have no truly ancient tradition, no knowledge made old by time. Their memories, he says, have been repeatedly cut short. And why? Because humanity keeps getting destroyed. Not necessarily all at once, not necessarily in one final apocalypse. The priest describes recurring catastrophes, great fires from above, great floods from below. The language is mythic, but the underlying idea is surprisingly clear. Civilizations are fragile, records are fragile, knowledge is fragile. A society can spend centuries building libraries, temples, laws, genealogies, and historical traditions, then lose them in a few days. Imagine it. A flood destroys coastal settlements and river valleys, where the largest populations live. The survivors flee to higher ground, but the people who escape are often not the scribes, administrators, and priests guarding archives in the cities. They are shepherds, farmers, mountain dwellers, people scattered far from the centres of government. They survive physically, but the written memory of the society does not survive with them. Then the rebuilding begins. Children grow up after the disaster. They hear fragments, a story about a drowned city, a story about kings who ruled before the waters came, a story about fire falling from the sky. But the names are gone, the dates are gone, the records are gone, and after enough generations, the survivors do not think of themselves as people who lost to civilization. They think they are the beginning. That, the priest says, is what keeps happening to Greece. Each catastrophe leaves behind a smaller population, stripped of literacy and historical knowledge. Humanity starts over again and again, like a forest growing back after a fire. New villages, new laws, new temples, new stories, and eventually people mistake the new growth for the whole forest. It is a brutal idea, not that human beings forget details. Everyone forgets details. The priest is saying entire civilizations can forget their own existence. And that is why the Greeks are called children. They are culturally young because they remember only the latest chapter of a much longer human story. Now compare that with Egypt, at least as Plato presents it. Egypt is the opposite of a society that keeps starting over. The Nile rises and falls in a reliable rhythm. The land is renewed each year. Temples endure. Priestly institutions preserve ritual, royal names, land records, astronomical observations, and accounts of the past. While Greece is portrayed as a landscape shattered by sudden catastrophe, Egypt is portrayed as a protected archive. The priest makes this claim very directly. Other lands, he says, are destroyed by fire or flood. But Egypt is saved by its geography. The Nile does not behave like a sudden rainstorm crashing down from the sky. It rises from below, on its own regular cycle. Egypt, in Plato's story, is not merely ancient. It is sheltered from the forces that erase memory elsewhere. That is the foundation of the Atlantis claim. If Egypt remembers more than Greece, then Egypt can tell Greece things about Greece that Greece itself has forgotten. An ancient Athens, a war against Atlantis, a catastrophe so old that no Greek poem, inscription, or family tradition has preserved it. It is an enormously effective setup. Before Plato asks us to believe in Atlantis, he gives us a reason why we have never heard of it anywhere else. The Greeks forgot, but we have to be careful here. This is where Plato's literary Egypt and historical Egypt begin to separate. Egypt really did have an exceptionally long written tradition by ancient standards. Egyptian scribes recorded kings, taxes, temple endowments, religious rituals, military campaigns, and idealized accounts of national history. Some monuments and textual traditions reached back many centuries before Plato. To a Greek visitor in the 6th or 5th century BCE, Egypt could seem unimaginably old. Its pyramids were already ancient. Its temples preserved names from eras that had vanished long before classical Athens existed. So Plato was not inventing Egypt's reputation for antiquity out of nowhere. But Egypt was not an unbroken vault of perfect memory either. Egyptian history included invasions, civil wars, dynastic collapse, periods of foreign rule, damaged monuments, lost archives, and deliberate rewriting of the past. Pharaohs sometimes erased predecessors from inscriptions. Royal lists could skip inconvenient rulers. Texts were copied, reinterpreted, and shaped by religious and political needs. Egyptian record-keeping was impressive. It was not neutral, complete, or immune to loss. And no Egyptian text independently confirms the conversation Plato describes. We have no surviving inscription from Sais saying that Solon arrived and was told about a 9,000-year-old war with Atlantis. No Egyptian papyrus naming Atlantis. No temple archive describing ancient Athens as the saviour of the Mediterranean world. The story survives in Plato's Greek dialogues, and in Plato's dialogues alone. That does not prove every element was invented from nothing. Ancient stories can preserve distant memories in strange forms. Greeks did travel to Egypt. Solon's visit is historically plausible, even if the specific conversation cannot be verified. Egyptian priests may well have impressed Greek visitors with claims of immense antiquity. They may have told flood stories, king lists, and accounts of cycles of destruction. Those ideas existed in the ancient world, but Plato's priest is still Plato's priest. He speaks with exactly the authority the dialogue needs. He is ancient, educated, calm, and backed by records supposedly older than Greek memory itself. He can correct Solon. He can puncture Greek pride. And most importantly, he can reveal that Athens has forgotten its own greatest achievement. That reversal is the real sting of the rebuke. The Greeks thought of Egypt as old. Fine, but the priest goes further. He tells Solon that Greek civilization is not just younger than Egypt. It is amnesiac. It has mistaken survival after catastrophe for the beginning of history. And then he offers the cure. Egypt remembers. Or at least Egypt remembers in the story Plato is about to tell. So what exactly is the number? Not what people say Plato meant. Not what later writers assumed. Not what we wish the number meant, because it would make Atlantis fit some known civilization. What does Plato's text actually say? The answer is simple. And it is also the beginning of the problem. In the dialogue called Timaeus, the Egyptian priest tells Solon that Athens once fought a great war against an invading power from beyond the pillars of Heracles. That power was Atlantis. And the priest gives the date in one startling phrase. The events happened, he says, 9,000 years before Solon's time. Not 9,000 years before Plato. Not 9,000 years before the building of the pyramids. Not 9,000 years before some vague legendary age. Before Solon. That detail matters more than almost anything else in the Atlantis story. Solon was an Athenian statesman, poet and lawgiver who lived around the turn of the 6th century BCE. His exact dates are not perfectly secure, as often happens with people from the ancient world, but he is usually placed roughly between 630 and 560 BCE. His famous reforms at Athens are conventionally dated to around 594 BCE. So take Plato's number literally. Start around 600 BCE. Go back 9,000 years, you land around 9,600 BCE. That is the late 10th millennium BCE, the world of the very end of the last ice age. A world before pharaohs, before Sumerian cities, before Minoan palaces, before Stonehenge, before metal tools, before writing, before anything we would normally call recorded history. And this is where Atlantis stops being just a lost city mystery. Because Plato is not placing the war in a dimly remembered Bronze Age. He is not placing it around the time of Mycenae, Crete, Troy, or Egypt's Old Kingdom. A literal reading puts it thousands of years before all of them. Far deeper in time than the civilizations usually offered as Atlantis candidates. Think about the scale of that claim. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built around 2560 BCE. From Solon's perspective, that was already more than 2,000 years old. Ancient beyond ancient, yet Plato's Egyptian priest is claiming knowledge of events more than 6,000 years earlier still. To Solon, the pyramids would have been old history. The Athenian-Atlantean War would have been prehistory beyond the pyramids. That is why the number changes everything. People can argue about where Atlantis was located. Spain, Santorini, Sardinia, the Atlantic coast of Morocco, the Azores, the Caribbean, Antarctica, if the theory gets especially adventurous. But before asking where Atlantis was, we have to ask when Plato says it existed. And Plato's answer on the surface is brutally early, around 9,600 BCE. But there is an important distinction that often gets blurred. The 9,000-year figure dates the war. Specifically, it dates the war in which ancient Athens, according to the priest, resisted Atlantis as it tried to conquer lands inside the Mediterranean. The number is attached to that conflict. 9,000 years had passed since the war. Then Plato describes the final catastrophe. Atlantis suffers earthquakes and floods. In a single dreadful day and night, the Athenian army is swallowed by the earth, and the island of Atlantis disappears beneath the sea. Those events come after the war, but Plato does not stop and give us a separate, precise calendar date for the destruction. That may sound like a small technical point. It is not. The story creates a sequence. First, Atlantis expands. Then it attacks. Ancient Athens leads the resistance. The Atlantean forces are defeated, and afterwards, violent natural disasters destroy both the Athenian army and Atlantis itself. The text makes the war and the drowning part of one connected historical drama. But it does not say the war occurred in year 1, and Atlantis sank exactly 3 years later, or 10 years later, or a century later. All we know is that the catastrophe follows the conflict. Most readers naturally assume the interval was short. The narrative moves quickly from victory to destruction. The Greek word Plato uses gives the sense of events happening afterward as a consequence or continuation of the same sequence. But a dramatic sequence is not the same thing as an exact chronology. So the safest way to state it is this. Plato dates the Athenian-Atlantean War to 9,000 years before Solon. He places the final earthquake and flood after that war, and he does not provide a separate numerical date for the sinking. That means around 9,600 BCE is the approximate date for the whole Atlantis episode, only if we assume the destruction followed soon after the war. And honestly, that is probably what Plato expects us to assume. But even with that small caution, the timeline remains astonishing. Around 9,600 BCE, agriculture was beginning to emerge in a few parts of the Near East. Human communities were adapting to a rapidly changing climate as glaciers retreated and sea levels rose. There were hunter-gatherers, early settled communities, ritual sites, and increasingly complex societies in some regions. But there is no accepted archaeological evidence for a globe-spanning naval empire with vast armies, monumental cities, imperial provinces, and the power to threaten the Mediterranean world. And Plato does not describe Atlantis as a modest coastal village. He describes a wealthy, organized, technologically capable state. A place with kings, laws, temples, harbours, shipyards, canals, fleets, cavalry, fortified rings of land and water, and access to resources across a huge territory. It commands an empire. It launches a military campaign against Europe and Asia. Then there is ancient Athens, the other half of the claim. Plato's story says Athens existed at this same remote date as a disciplined, virtuous, militarily powerful city. Not classical Athens, not the Athens of the Parthenon, philosophers or democracy. An even older Athens, built on a model of social order Plato deeply admired. So a literal reading does not ask us to find one lost civilization around 9,600 BCE. It asks us to find two, an imperial Atlantis beyond the pillars of Heracles, and a highly organized ancient Athens capable of defeating it. Neither has been identified in the archaeological record. That is the central obstacle, not the lack of a sunken island by itself. Coastlines flood, settlements vanish, earthquakes and volcanic eruptions destroy cities. The ancient world is full of places that disappeared and were later rediscovered. The problem is the date combined with the scale. A destroyed Bronze Age city is plausible. We have many. A seafaring power buried by an eruption is plausible. Thera, the volcanic island, now called Santorini, really did devastate the Minoan world in the 2nd millennium BCE. A memory of catastrophic flooding after the Ice Age is plausible. Sea levels did rise dramatically as glaciers melted, swallowing huge areas of former coastline. But a vast Atlantean empire and a heroic Athenian state in the 10th millennium BCE. That is a much larger claim. It would require evidence on a scale archaeology has not found. And that is why the 9,000-year number has never been a minor detail to explain away later. It is the pressure point of the entire story. If the number is literal, Atlantis belongs to a time so remote that every straightforward historical identification becomes extraordinarily difficult. If the number is not literal, then we have a different mystery. Why did Plato give it at all? So why did Plato give it at all? Before we decide that the number was symbolic, corrupted, mistranslated, or simply invented, There is one more basic question to ask. Could Solon really have been in Egypt? Not could Plato imagine him there. Plato absolutely could. Egypt, to a Greek writer, was the land of ancient wisdom, colossal monuments, priestly records, and memories older than anything Greece could claim. The harder question is whether the historical Solon had any realistic opportunity to meet Egyptian priests and hear Egyptian traditions. And the answer is interesting. Not proven, but plausible. Solon was not a shadowy figure invented by later storytellers. He was one of the most famous Athenians of the archaic age. A poet, politician, lawgiver, and reformer whose name remained powerful for centuries after his death. Around 594 BCE, Athens faced a serious internal crisis. Debt, slavery, inequality, conflict between rich landowners and poorer citizens. Solon was given extraordinary authority to rewrite laws and stabilize the city before it tore itself apart. He cancelled certain debts. He changed rules around citizenship and political participation. He tried to reduce the power of aristocratic families without simply handing control to the crowd. Nobody was completely satisfied, which honestly may be the clearest sign that he was doing actual politics. Then, according to ancient tradition, Solon left Athens. Herodotus, writing about a century and a half later, says Solon travelled for 10 years after making his laws. The reason was practical. He had made reforms that powerful people disliked, and he did not want Athenians pressuring him to revise them the moment he left office. So he went abroad and let the laws settle in. Herodotus places Solon in places like Cyprus and Lydia, where he supposedly met the immensely wealthy king Croesus. That famous meeting has problems. The chronology does not fit neatly. Croesus probably came to power after Solon was already dead or near the end of his life. Ancient historians themselves were not always working with calendars precise enough to catch every mismatch. A story can preserve a real tradition while getting its timing wrong. Or it can be a later moral tale built around two famous names. But the larger point remains. Solon travelling after his reforms is not some wild idea invented by Plato. Ancient writers broadly remembered him as a man who went abroad, observed other societies, met foreign rulers, and returned with a wider perspective than most Athenians possessed. Egypt belongs naturally in that world. Plato's own account in Timaeus has Solon visiting the Egyptian city of Sais in the western Nile delta. There he speaks with priests at the temple of the goddess Neith. Solon begins telling them Greek traditions, the flood of Deucalion, the origins of Athens, the old stories his people believed preserved their deepest past. And then comes the priest's rebuke. You Greeks are always children. You remember only the latest disaster. You think your own surviving traditions are ancient because you have forgotten how many times civilization has been destroyed and begun again. It is one of the great scenes in ancient literature. But was it a historical conversation? That is where we have to slow down. The ancient biographer Plutarch, writing many centuries after Solon, also says, Solon went to Egypt. He even gives names for priests whom Solon supposedly met, Xenophis of Heliopolis and Sonchis of Sais. According to Plutarch, these priests told Solon the Atlantis story, and Solon planned to turn it into a poem but never completed it. That sounds wonderfully specific. Specific names, specific cities. A project left unfinished. But specific is not the same as verified. Plutarch was writing in the Roman period, long after Solon, Plato, and the Classical Age. He had access to earlier traditions, some now lost to us. But he also wrote moral biographies, not modern critical histories. He was interested in character lessons, memorable scenes. We cannot simply treat every detail he gives as a transcript from the 6th century BCE. And there is a bigger problem. No Egyptian inscription that we know of says Solon came to Sais. No surviving temple record tells us Egyptian priests gave an Athenian lawgiver a 9,000-year account of Atlantis. No contemporary Greek document records the conversation either. That absence does not prove Solon never visited Egypt. Ancient travel leaves very little paperwork. Most visitors vanish from the record completely. But it does mean we cannot move from Solon may have travelled there to we know exactly what Egyptian priests told him. Those are very different claims. Still, Sais itself was not a random location chosen from a map. During Solon's lifetime, Egypt was in the Site period, the age of the 26th dynasty, and Sais was its political centre. For much of the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, Sate kings ruled a reunified Egypt from the Delta. This was a period of revival, wealth, diplomacy, military activity, and intense contact with the wider Mediterranean. Egypt was not isolated behind some ancient wall, silently preserving secrets while foreigners stood outside. Greek mercenaries served Egyptian kings. Greek traders moved through Egyptian ports. Greek pottery appears in Egypt. Egyptian goods, ideas, stories, and religious images travelled in the other direction. By the 6th century BCE, Greeks had a major trading settlement at Naucratis in the Nile Delta, not far from Saitic power. The exact date of its foundation is debated, but Greek-Egyptian contact in this period is beyond doubt. So imagine what that means. A famous Athenian lawgiver, travelling after a political crisis, arrives in a country ruled by a dynasty actively dealing with Greeks. He moves through the Delta where interpreters, merchants, soldiers, sailors, officials, and religious personnel all inhabit the same crowded world. He hears stories. He sees monuments older than anything in Athens. He visits temples whose priesthoods possessed rituals, archives, king lists and traditions reaching back into Egypt's deep past. Could he have encountered Egyptian priests? Almost certainly. Could priests at Sais have spoken to a prominent Greek visitor about Egyptian history, myths, floods, ancient kings, or the antiquity of their civilization? Again, entirely plausible. Would those conversations have been translated perfectly between Greek and Egyptian? Would Solon have understood the categories Egyptians used for time, gods, nations, and distant history? Would a priestly tale told in one setting become the same tale, when retold in Athens decades later, then reshaped by Plato more than a century after Solon's death? Now we are entering much more uncertain ground, because Plato's chain is already long. Egyptian priests tell Solon. Solon tells Dropides. Dropides tells his descendants. Critias the elder tells Critias the younger. Critias tells Socrates and the other speakers in Plato's dialogue. Every link may preserve something. Every link may also transform it. That does not mean Plato made the entire Egyptian setting up from nothing. Egypt was a credible place for Greeks to seek ancient knowledge. Sais was a credible city. Solon was a credible traveller. Priests were credible custodians of local tradition. But credibility is not confirmation. The historically careful conclusion is more modest, and maybe more fascinating. Solon in Egypt is possible. Solon at Sais is possible. Solon speaking with priests is possible. Greek access to Egyptian stories in this period is not just possible but expected. The precise Atlantis conversation, the exact 9,000-year date, and the claim of a written Egyptian record reaching back to an ancient war between Athens and Atlantis. Those remain Plato's report, and that distinction matters, because next we need to understand why Sais, of all Egyptian cities, may have been the perfect place for Plato to set this encounter. Sais was not just the perfect place because Solon could plausibly have gone there. It was the perfect place because, in Plato's story, Sais had a connection to Athens that was deeper than trade, diplomacy, or the fact that both cities existed in the same Mediterranean world. It had a shared goddess. The Egyptian city of Sais stood in the western Nile delta, in a region of marshes, river channels, farmland, and routes leading toward the sea. Today its ruins are not as famous as the pyramids or the temples of Luxor. But in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, Sais was one of the most important cities in Egypt. It was the home city of the 26th dynasty, the Site kings, who reunited much of the country after a long period of fragmentation. And at the centre of Sais stood the cult of Neith. Neith was an ancient Egyptian goddess, older than the Site dynasty by many centuries. Her origins disappear into Egypt's earliest religious history. She could be a goddess of war, hunting, weaving, wisdom, creation, and royal power. That sounds like a lot because Egyptian gods were not always confined to one clean job description. A deity could hold several roles at once, gather new meanings over time, and take on different forms in different cities. Neith was associated with the bow and arrow, with shields. With the craft of weaving in some Egyptian traditions, she was a primordial creator, a divine being present before the ordered world had fully begun. One ancient formula describes her as the mother of the sun god. Even though she herself was not simply a solar deity, she was powerful, old, mysterious, and tied to the protection of Egypt. And when Greek writers encountered Neith, they often saw someone familiar, Athena. To Greek observers, Neith looked enough like Athena to be identified with her. Both were female protective deities, both had connections to war and wisdom. Both could be associated with skilled crafts. Athena was the armed guardian of Athens, the goddess of strategic intelligence, weaving, civic order, and the city itself. Neith, from an Egyptian perspective, was not Athena in an Egyptian costume. They belonged to different religious worlds, with different myths, rituals, and histories. But Greeks did not approach foreign gods the way a modern comparative religion textbook might. They looked for equivalence. If another people worshipped a goddess who carried weapons, protected a city, and possessed wisdom and technical skill, then a Greek could reasonably say that is Athena under another name. Plato makes this identification central to the story. In Timaeus, the Egyptian priest tells Solon that the goddess worshipped at Sais is the same goddess Athenians call Athena. The priest says she founded both cities, first Sais, according to the Egyptian version, and Athens earlier still. The implication is extraordinary. Athens and Sais are not merely two cities that happen to respect similar goddesses. They are sister cities, joined by a common divine founder, and suddenly the whole setting changes. The Egyptians are no longer strangers telling Greeks a story about some distant, forgotten people. The priest is speaking to Solon as someone whose city shares a sacred inheritance with Egypt. He is effectively saying, "We know Athens, we honour the same goddess. We preserve the memory of your ancestors when you did not." That is exactly what Plato needs. Because the Atlantis story is not really just about Atlantis. Atlantis is the spectacular part, the island empire, the colossal wealth, the vast armies, the destruction beneath the sea. That is the part people remember. But Plato's story also contains another city, ancient Athens, not the Athens of Solon, not the Athens of Plato. An Athens supposedly existing 9,000 years before Solon, before Greek history, before the Bronze Age, before anything Greeks thought they knew about their own past. This primordial Athens is presented as disciplined, courageous, moderately governed, and devoted to the kind of civic virtue Plato admired. It defeats the aggressive Atlantean Empire, then vanishes from memory after a catastrophe of earthquakes and floods. So Plato needs a reason why Egypt would preserve a record of ancient Athens while Athenians themselves had forgotten it. Neith gives him one. If Athena and Neith are the same goddess, then Sais has a religious reason to care about Athens. Its priests might preserve the history of Athena's other city. A story of ancient Athenian heroism would not be foreign trivia in a Sais temple. It would be part of the goddess's own sacred past. Think about how elegant that is. Athens receives praise from Egypt, the civilization Greeks saw as unimaginably ancient. But the praise is not random flattery from a foreign priest. It comes from a city linked to Athens through the goddess of wisdom, warfare, and civic order. The Athenians are being told that their own forgotten ancestors once lived up to the ideals their city now struggles to achieve. For Plato, that makes the story sharper. The greatest Athenian victory was not remembered by Athenians. The memory survived in Egypt, and it survived, supposedly, because Egypt had not suffered the same repeated destruction of records, cities and populations that had erased Greek memory. That claim will matter enormously as we move forward. But first, notice how much real history Plato is building around. The Sais era was a genuine period of unusually intense Greek-Egyptian contact. Saite kings hired Greek mercenaries. Soldiers from the Greek world served in Egypt's armies, especially as Egypt dealt with threats from Assyria, Babylon, and rival powers around the eastern Mediterranean. Greek traders visited Egyptian ports. Greek pottery, metalwork, and luxury goods circulated in the delta. Egyptians exported grain, papyrus, linen, perfume, and other goods into Mediterranean networks. And then there was Naucratis. Naucratis was a Greek trading settlement in the Nile Delta, established during the Saite period, probably under royal supervision. Ancient writers connected its foundation, especially with King Amasis, who ruled Egypt in the 6th century BCE. The details are debated. Archaeology has complicated parts of the later literary account. But the broad reality is secure enough. Naucratis became a major point of contact between Greek communities and Egypt. It was not some isolated Greek colony planted in empty land. It was a place where Greek merchants operated inside an Egyptian political system. Goods moved through it. Languages moved through it. Religious offerings moved through it. Greek visitors encountered Egyptian temples. Officials, scribes, sailors, craftsmen, and interpreters. Egyptians encountered Greeks who had come not as mythical heroes, but as traders, soldiers, diplomats, and travellers looking for opportunity. Sais was not far away in political terms. The Saite kings ruled from that region. Their court, their military networks, and their religious institutions were part of the same delta world in which Greek contact was growing. So when Plato places Solon at Sais, he is choosing a location with real historical weight. A famous Greek visitor could plausibly reach it. A priest there could plausibly know something about Greeks. There could plausibly be translators, commercial connections, and people accustomed to dealing with foreigners. And a Greek listener could plausibly hear Neith explained as Athena. None of that proves the Atlantis conversation happened. But it does mean Plato was not constructing his Egyptian setting with no regard for reality. He placed the encounter at a city that was politically powerful in Solon's lifetime, religiously connected to his own city through Greek interpretation, and deeply embedded in the expanding network between Egypt and the Greek world. That gives us two possible reasons for Plato's choice. The historical reason is clear. Sais made sense in the world of the 6th century BCE. It was a capital city in a Greek-facing dynasty, near the commercial routes through which Greeks actually entered Egypt. The symbolic reason may be even more important. Sais gave Plato a temple of Neith. Neith could become Athena, and Athena could link Egypt's ancient records to Athens' ancient identity. Maybe Plato chose Sais because it was historically credible. Maybe he chose it because the Neith-Athena connection made his philosophical story work. Or maybe, most likely, he chose it because it did both at once. That is often how powerful ancient stories are built. Not from pure invention, not from plain history, but from real places, real contacts, real religious translations, and then one enormous leap beyond what the evidence can verify. Sais was real. Neith was real. Greek contact with Sate Egypt was real. The claim that priests of Neith preserved a 9,000-year-old record of Athens and Atlantis is something else. And now we have to ask the question Plato wants us to ask. Could Egyptian priests really preserve records, traditions, and historical memory across thousands of years? The short answer is yes, but not in the simple way people often imagine. Egyptian priests really could preserve knowledge across extraordinary spans of time. By the standards of the ancient Mediterranean, Egypt possessed a historical memory that must have seemed almost supernatural. Greek cities rose and fell, archives burned, political systems changed. Oral traditions shifted with every generation. But along the Nile, temples had been collecting, copying, reciting, and rebuilding traditions for thousands of years. That part is real. The question is whether that ability proves Plato's specific claim, that priests at Sais possessed an accurate written account of Athens and Atlantis from 9,000 years before Solon. That is a much bigger leap. To understand why, we need to understand what an Egyptian temple actually was. It was not just a place where people came to pray. A major temple was an economic institution, a sacred institution, an educational institution, and in many cases an archive. It owned land, it employed workers, it received offerings. It managed grain, livestock, textiles, tools, and tax obligations. It had administrators, ritual specialists, craftsmen, and scribes did not merely write down stories. They copied contracts, inventories, royal decrees, hymns, medical texts, astronomical observations, ritual instructions, legal formulas, and lists of kings. Egypt had writing by around 3200 BCE. That alone gave it an enormous advantage in preserving memory. A society with writing can remember things no living person remembers. It can pass information across centuries without relying entirely on a storyteller getting every detail right. A name carved in stone, copied onto papyrus, or repeated in a temple inscription could outlive dynasties, and Egyptian civilization had a remarkable habit of looking backward. Pharaohs constantly presented themselves as restorers of an ancient order. A king might rebuild a temple and claim he was renewing what the ancestors had established. Priests preserved old ritual language long after everyday speech had changed. Tomb inscriptions remembered officials, family lines, offices, and royal events. Temple walls recorded campaigns, donations, building projects, victories, defeats, sometimes carefully disguised, and the king's relationship with the gods. The Egyptians were not historians in the modern sense. They were not trying to produce neutral timelines with footnotes and source criticism. But they cared deeply about the past. They cared because the past was sacred. For Egyptians, proper ritual had to be performed correctly because it had been established by the gods and maintained by the ancestors. Kings ruled legitimately because they stood in a chain reaching back to the first rulers of Egypt. The world itself depended on Ma'at, the principle of order, balance, truth, and cosmic stability. Preserving ancient forms was not nostalgia. It was part of keeping the universe from sliding into chaos. So when Plato has an Egyptian priest speak as though Egypt remembers what Greece has forgotten, he is using something that would have sounded believable to Greek audiences. Egypt really was old. By Solon's lifetime, the Great Pyramids at Giza were already more than 2,000 years old. The Old Kingdom was as remote from 6th century Egyptians as the Roman Empire is from us. Temples stood on sites with sacred histories reaching back through dynasties that had risen, collapsed, and been replaced. Egyptian priests could point to monuments, inscriptions, royal names, and ritual traditions that made Greek civic memory seem young by comparison. That is probably part of why Greek writers were so impressed by Egypt. To them, Egypt looked like a civilization that had never forgotten. But here is the complication. Preserving traditions for millennia is not the same thing as preserving a complete, accurate archive for millennia. Egyptian records did not survive in one uninterrupted vault from the beginning of civilization to Plato's day. Papyrus decays. Temples were abandoned, looted, damaged, rebuilt, and repurposed. Capitals moved, dynasties fell, foreign armies invaded. Priestly institutions changed. Some texts survived because scribes copied them again and again. Others disappeared completely. And even when a tradition survived, it could change. A king list is a good example. Egypt preserved lists of rulers, sometimes in temples, sometimes in tombs, sometimes in later historical compilations. These lists are invaluable to modern historians, but they are not simple objective records. Some leave out rulers seen as illegitimate. Some ignore periods of division and civil war. Some arrange the past to make a political point. A new dynasty did not always want to honour the people it had replaced. The past was preserved, but it was also edited. That matters enormously for Atlantis. When Plato says the Egyptian priests had records going back 9,000 years, we should not picture a modern archive with carefully dated documents filed year by year, beginning around 9600 BCE and continuing without interruption until Solon walked through the temple doors. There is no evidence that Egyptian scribes possessed that kind of continuous documentary record from so far before the beginning of Egyptian civilization. Around 9600 BCE, Egypt had no pharaohs, no hieroglyphic writing, no pyramids, no temple bureaucracy in the form we recognize from later history. Human communities lived in the Nile Valley and surrounding regions, of course. But the first Egyptian writing lies thousands of years in the future. So could the priests have preserved a story whose setting was supposedly 9,000 years before Solon, as a sacred tradition, a mythic age, or a vast inherited chronology maybe, as a literal written historical report created at the time of Atlantis. The evidence is simply not there. And Plato's wording leaves room for exactly this ambiguity. The priest speaks of temple records, yes, but ancient temple knowledge was not divided into neat modern categories like history, religion, astronomy, myth, and philosophy. A temple tradition could combine all of them. A king's reign could be historical. The gods who granted him power could be sacred. The age before the first kings could stretch backward into a world of divine rulers, heroic ancestors, catastrophes, and events beyond ordinary human time. For an Egyptian priest, these might not have been separate kinds of truth. A story could be ancient because it was ritually ancient. It could be true because it expressed the order of the world. It could preserve a memory of real disasters while placing them in a sacred chronology that no modern historian could verify year by year. Think of it like a river. At its source, there may be real water, actual rulers, actual floods, actual wars, actual migrations, actual ruined cities. But by the time the river has passed through thousands of years of temples, ceremonies, scribal copying, political change, and sacred interpretation, other streams have flowed into it. Myth, theology, dynastic propaganda, local pride, stories borrowed, adapted, and reshaped for new audiences. The water is still real, but it is no longer pure. This is why Egypt's long memory makes Plato's setting plausible without making Atlantis historically proven. Egyptian priests were among the people most capable of claiming deep antiquity. They had texts, they had monuments, they had institutions older than almost anything a Greek visitor knew. They had a culture built around preserving what came before. But the more ancient the claim becomes, the harder it is to separate documented memory from sacred time. And 9,000 years is not just ancient, it is beyond the horizon of Egypt's own written beginnings. So perhaps the priest's claim was never meant to sound like a file pulled from a cabinet. Perhaps it was meant to sound bigger than that, a memory preserved not only in documents, but in the sacred identity of Egypt itself, a memory of ages before ordinary history began. Which brings us to the next problem. When an Egyptian priest says 9,000 years, what does that number actually mean? To answer that, we have to step into an Egyptian way of measuring time, and it is very different from ours. Today, we imagine history as one long-numbered line, 2026. Before that, 2025. Before that, 2024. Keep moving backward, and eventually you reach 9,600 BCE, the approximate date implied by Plato's 9,000-year claim. That is not how most ancient Egyptians dated ordinary events. They usually dated things by the reign of the current king. A document might say it was written in year 12 of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, followed by the pharaoh's royal name. A tax record, a building inscription, a military expedition, a grain delivery, a legal agreement. Everything was anchored to the ruler on the throne at that moment. When the king died, the clock effectively restarted. Year 1 of the new king, then year 2, then year 3. This worked perfectly well for administration in the present. Everyone knew who the king was. The temple scribes knew which regnal year they were in. But it made deep chronology difficult. If you wanted to calculate how far back something happened, you had to know the sequence of rulers, know how long each one reigned, and decide what to do about rival kings, co-rulers, civil wars, and periods when Egypt was divided between different dynasties. And Egypt had plenty of those. There were ages when one pharaoh ruled from the Nile Delta to Nubia. Then there were ages when northern and southern Egypt were controlled by competing royal houses. There were foreign dynasties. There were kings whose names later rulers tried to erase. There were short-lived claimants, child kings, palace coups, and gaps in the surviving records. So an Egyptian scribe could preserve an impressively old past without possessing a single unbroken timeline that worked like a modern calendar. Think of it like a chain made of thousands of links. Some links are solid. We have monuments, inscriptions, tombs, dated documents. Some are damaged, some are missing, and some may have been deliberately removed because a later king did not want to remember the person who came before him. Yet Egypt also had something remarkable, a formal civil year. The Egyptian civil calendar had 365 days. It divided the year into 12 months of 30 days, followed by 5 extra days at the end. Those 5 days were special, associated in myth with the births of major gods. The calendar was elegant, practical, and astonishingly durable. But it had one major flaw. It did not include leap years. The true solar year is about 365 and 1/4 days. So the Egyptian calendar slowly drifted through the seasons, about 1 day every 4 years. Over centuries, the calendar's new year moved through the agricultural cycle. Eventually, it would return to its original position after roughly 1,460 years. For a civilization built around the Nile flood, this could sound chaotic. But Egyptians also watched the sky, the river, and the seasons. The annual rising of Sirius, the bright star they called Sopdet, became deeply important because it appeared around the time of the inundation in certain periods. Priests and astronomer scribes observed these patterns over generations. This is the crucial point. Egyptian timekeeping was not primitive. It was careful, institutional, observant. Temple specialists tracked recurring patterns in the heavens and the floodplain across spans that exceeded any individual lifetime. They knew the world moved in cycles. The river returned, stars returned, kings died, dynasties rose, sacred rituals had to be renewed. But cyclical observation is not the same thing as a linear historical count reaching cleanly back 10,000 years. The Egyptians could measure the return of the year with extraordinary seriousness, while also imagining the past as something far deeper than a list of dates. That deeper past appears in their king lists. Some king lists are straightforwardly historical, at least in intention. They name human rulers and their succession. The Abydos king list carved under Seti presents a long line of royal predecessors. The Turin king list, preserved only in fragments, once contained an even more extensive sequence of reigns. Later, the Egyptian priest Manetho would organize Egyptian rulers into the dynasties historians still use today: First Dynasty, Second Dynasty, Third Dynasty, and so on. These documents are invaluable, but they also reveal the problem. They are not neutral spreadsheets. The Abydos list leaves out several rulers modern historians know existed, including female pharaoh Hatshepsut and the controversial king Akhenaten. Why? Almost certainly because Seti's court had reasons to present a cleaner, more legitimate version of the royal past. The list was not merely recording history, it was defining rightful order, and beyond the human kings, Egyptian tradition went even further back. Before the first dynasties, some traditions described Egypt as ruled by gods: Ra, Geb, Osiris, Horus. After them came beings often translated as the followers of Horus, semi-divine ancestral rulers standing somewhere between mythology and human kingship. In Egyptian sacred history, the first pharaoh was not simply a political office holder. He inherited a cosmic role established at the beginning of the world. Every living king was Horus on earth, linked to an original age when gods themselves had ruled Egypt. Now imagine what this does to chronology. Once divine reigns enter the sequence, time can expand enormously. A god may rule not for 20 years or 40 years, but for thousands. A sacred age may not function as a normal historical period at all. It may represent cosmic order, ritual time, or the distance between the imperfect present and the perfect beginning. Later writers pushed these numbers to extraordinary lengths. Manetho's history, surviving only through quotations and summaries written centuries afterward, reportedly included divine rulers, heroes, and spirit beings before mortal dynasties. The totals assigned to these early ages could run into tens of thousands of years. We should be careful here. The surviving text is fragmentary, mediated, and difficult to reconstruct. But the basic idea is clear. Egyptian tradition could place human civilization inside a past of immense depth. Not a past measured only in contracts and regnal years. A past measured in sacred succession. This is where modern readers can get trapped. We hear 9,000 years, and we assume it must be either exact history or a simple mistake. But ancient numbers often did more than count. They expressed magnitude. They marked an event as unimaginably old. They placed it before known dynasties, before ordinary political memory, before the world people recognized as their own. A number could be precise. Egyptian scribes absolutely used precise numbers for grain, land, labour, taxes, and regnal years. But in sacred narratives, huge numbers could also signal something else. This happened in the age before the age. So when Plato's Egyptian priest tells Solon that Athens and Atlantis existed 9,000 years earlier, the claim sits between two very different systems of time. On one side there is historical Egypt, kings, inscriptions, temple accounts, calendars, and real dynastic records. On the other, there is sacred Egypt, gods, primeval rulers, cyclical destruction, and a civilization whose origins disappear into mythic antiquity. The priest's number may be asking us to stand exactly on that border. It sounds historical. It is attached to a war, a city, and a date before Solon. But it reaches beyond the beginning of Egyptian writing, beyond the first pharaohs, and deep into the kind of past where Egyptian tradition itself could become cosmic rather than documentary. And that raises the tempting possibility that has fascinated Atlantis researchers for generations. What if the number was never supposed to mean 9,000 solar years at all? What if, somewhere between Egyptian priests, Solon, Greek storytellers, and Plato, the unit of time changed? What if that is exactly what happened? What if the Egyptian priest did not say 9,000 years at all? What if he gave Solon a number in months, and somewhere in the long journey from Egyptian temple records to Greek philosophical dialogue, the unit changed? This is the year or month theory, and on the surface it is almost irresistible. Take Plato's number 9,000. If those are years, the war between ancient Athens and Atlantis happened around 9600 BCE. That places it near the end of the last ice age, thousands of years before Egypt, before cities, before metalworking, before writing, before anything resembling the powerful states Plato describes. But if those are months, everything changes. 9,000 months divided by 12 gives 750 years. Solon lived around 600 BCE. Go back roughly 750 years, and you arrive somewhere around 1350 BCE, and suddenly Atlantis is no longer an Ice Age mystery. It lands in the Bronze Age. This is why the theory has endured for so long. A date around 1350 BCE feels like a date archaeologists can work with. It brings the story into the world of Minoan Crete, Mycenaean Greece, Egypt's New Kingdom, international trade, palace states, war fleets, and catastrophes large enough to echo through legend. It brings Atlantis close to real candidates. The eruption of Thera on the island now called Santorini had devastated part of the Aegean world centuries earlier, probably in the 17th century BCE. The Minoan civilization declined over the following generations. Later still came the great upheavals at the end of the Bronze Age, when palaces fell, trade networks fractured, and entire kingdoms disappeared from the eastern Mediterranean. A 750-year correction does not neatly solve the Atlantis problem. The dates still do not line up perfectly with every proposed event. But it moves the story from a world almost empty of known civilization into one overflowing with possible connections. That is a very powerful temptation. And there is another reason it sounds plausible. Ancient cultures did not always use the same units of time. Egyptians had months, Greeks had months, both also had years. Calendars varied, translation could be messy. If an Egyptian source referred to a long sequence of lunar or civil months, a Greek listener might misunderstand the unit, or a later storyteller might simplify it. 9,000 could survive while the word attached to it changed. It is easy to picture the mistake. An Egyptian priest says a sacred war occurred 9,000 months ago. Solon hears an enormous number and carries it home. Generations pass. The story is retold in Greek. Eventually, Plato writes 9,000 years. One small shift, one word, and a Bronze Age disaster becomes an event in the deep prehistoric past. But this is where the theory starts running into trouble. First, Plato does not present the 9,000 figure as an isolated fragment that might have been copied carelessly. In the dialogues, the time span is woven into the whole story. The priest tells Solon that the war happened 9,000 years earlier. He also says that the Egyptian records go back 8,000 years for ancient Athens. These are not random numbers floating without context. They establish the enormous antiquity of both civilizations. If 9,000 years secretly means months, should 8,000 years mean months too? Probably, but then Plato's ancient Athens would be only about 667 years older than Solon's time. That would place its founding in the late Bronze Age as well. Possible, perhaps, but it radically changes the scale of the priest's speech, which is built around the idea that Greek memory is shallow, while Egypt remembers an almost unimaginable past. Second, the Greek text repeatedly uses the normal Greek word for years, ete. Not months. Plato knew the difference. Greek had perfectly ordinary words for month and lunar month. If he wanted to tell his readers that the Egyptians counted time in months, he could have said so. He does not. That does not prove a mistake was impossible. Plato may have inherited a confused tradition. He may have intentionally translated an Egyptian unit into Greek years. Or he may have used years, because that was how the story had reached him. But the text itself gives us no signal that a conversion is taking place. And that is a serious problem. Third, Egyptian timekeeping does not strongly support the specific idea that months were routinely mistaken for years. Egypt certainly had a 12-month calendar, but its official civil calendar was built around a 365-day year, not a system that normally counted major historical events as thousands of months. Egyptian documents could date events by months and days within a king's regnal year, but for long spans, years and reigns were the more natural units. The theory requires not just translation, but a very particular kind of translation error. A priest, interpreter, Solon, storyteller, or Plato would have had to preserve the number 9,000 while losing the unit. Then everyone afterward would have accepted the inflated result without questioning it. That could happen. Ancient stories mutate, numbers drift, units get misunderstood. Anyone who has watched a message pass through 10 people knows how quickly details can become strange. Add multiple languages, centuries of retelling, sacred traditions, and political agendas, and the possibilities multiply. But possibility is not evidence. There is also the scale of the narrative itself. Atlantis is not described as a small island kingdom destroyed in a regional disaster. It is an imperial power that threatens Greece, Egypt, and lands inside the Mediterranean. Ancient Athens is portrayed as a formidable society capable of resisting it. The whole story is framed as part of a cycle of destructions that repeatedly erase human memory. That epic scale fits Plato's use of deep time. The point is not simply that something happened long ago. The point is that entire worlds can rise, become powerful, and vanish so completely that later people forget they ever existed. Turn 9,000 years into 750, and the story becomes more historically manageable. But it also becomes less mythically immense. So the year or month theory remains what it has always been, an ingenious rescue operation. It rescues Atlantis from the Ice Age and places it in a period where real civilizations, real wars, and real catastrophes existed. It gives researchers a date they can compare with Thera, the Minoans, Mycenae, Egypt, and the collapse of the Bronze Age world. But no surviving Egyptian text says the priests used months here. No passage in Plato says years is a mistranslation, and no decisive evidence shows that Solon made this particular error. The theory is worth discussing because it reveals how much depends on a single word. But until stronger evidence appears, 9,000 months is not the answer to Atlantis. It is a possibility, and beyond that possibility waits an even darker part of the priest's message, the reason Greeks had forgotten so much in the first place. And beyond that possibility waits an even darker part of the priest's message, the reason Greeks had forgotten so much in the first place. According to Plato, it was not because the Greeks were unintelligent. It was not because they had never built great cities or achieved anything worth remembering. They had forgotten because human memory keeps getting burned away. In the Timaeus, the Egyptian priest tells Solon that there have been many destructions of mankind, and that there will be more. Some come through water, some through fire. The greatest disasters, he says, arrive through these two forces. And the smaller ones, they happen so often that people barely remember them. This is the priest's explanation for why Greece seemed young while Egypt claimed such deep antiquity. Every time a catastrophe destroys cities, records, temples, rulers, and educated people, the survivors are thrown backward. They may still know how to farm. They may know how to hunt, build shelters, raise children. But writing disappears. Archives disappear. Laws disappear. The names of kings disappear. A civilization can collapse, and within a few generations the people left behind may know almost nothing about the world that existed before them. Think about how fragile memory really is. A library burns. A city falls. A language stops being spoken. The people who knew how to read old documents die, and suddenly an entire past becomes silent. The priest tells Solon that this is what repeatedly happened to the Greeks. After each destruction, the survivors began again, like children, without records of the earlier world. They remembered only what had happened recently. Everything older became myth. And then he gives an extraordinary example. The Greek myth of Phaethon. Phaethon, according to the familiar story, was the son of Helios, the sun god. He begged to drive his father's chariot across the sky. But he could not control the horses. The chariot flew too close to the earth. The land burned. Rivers dried. The world was nearly destroyed until Zeus struck Phaethon down with a thunderbolt. To a Greek listener, this was a myth, a dramatic story about arrogance, cosmic order, and a young man trying to command powers beyond his understanding. But the Egyptian priest offers another reading. He says the story contains a memory of something real, a deviation in the movements of heavenly bodies around the earth, producing a great burning of the world at long intervals. Now, this does not mean Plato had discovered astronomy in the modern sense. There is no evidence that ancient Egyptians possessed a scientific record of a planet striking Earth, or a precise account of a global celestial catastrophe. The priest's explanation is still mythic. It belongs to an ancient universe where the heavens, gods, and natural disasters were deeply connected. But the idea itself is fascinating. A fire from the sky. A world scorched. A disaster so ancient that only the shape of a story survives. That is how catastrophe myths may work. Not as newspaper reports from prehistory. Not as literal global history, but as emotional fossils. Memories of terror, loss, darkness, floodwater, ash, drought, and sudden death, compressed into gods and monsters because gods and monsters are easier to remember than geological processes. And ancient people had no shortage of reasons to fear the world. Floods could erase river settlements in days. Seasonal rivers could become unstoppable walls of water. Coastal storms could drown ports and fishing villages. Tsunamis, though their cause was not understood, could sweep inland with almost no warning and leave survivors describing the sea itself as an enemy. Drought was slower, but no less destructive. A few failed harvests could destabilize a kingdom. Food stores vanished, trade routes broke down, disease spread among weakened populations. Villages emptied, people migrated, fought, or starved. Earthquakes could destroy a city in minutes. Volcanic eruptions could cover fields in ash, poison the air, darken the sky, and send waves across entire seas. In the eastern Mediterranean alone, people lived beside fault lines, volcanoes, unstable coastlines, and a sea capable of turning violent without warning. For us, these are separate categories: earthquake, eruption, drought, flood, climate shift. For ancient societies, they could feel like one thing: the world ending. And if you enjoy exploring mysteries where history, myth, and real evidence collide, you can get the channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries on the website. The link is in the description. Here is the crucial distinction. Plato's recurring catastrophes do not prove that a single flood covered the entire planet. They do not prove that an advanced Ice Age civilization existed and was wiped from the map. The archaeological record does not support a literal global reset occurring every few thousand years. But regional collapse, that is absolutely real. Civilizations have disappeared before. Not always in one dramatic night, but sometimes with shocking speed. Palaces abandoned, capitals burned, trade systems broken, populations scattered, writing lost, later generations living among ruins whose builders they no longer understood. That is the emotional truth inside the priest's warning. Human civilization is not permanent simply because it feels permanent. Knowledge is not automatically preserved. It has to be copied, taught, protected, and carried through disaster by actual people. When those people vanish, memory can vanish with them. And this is why the story of Atlantis is not introduced as an isolated event. Before Plato tells us about the island empire, he gives us a universe in which civilizations are fragile and oblivion is normal. Atlantis is coming. But first, we are told that worlds can be swallowed by water, consumed by fire, and forgotten so completely that their survivors turn them into myths. And now, after all that warning about fire, flood, and civilizations disappearing from memory, Plato finally gives Solon the place. Atlantis lay beyond the pillars of Heracles. To a Greek audience, that phrase meant the gateway at the western edge of the known Mediterranean world. Today, we usually identify the pillars with the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage between southern Spain and North Africa, where the Mediterranean opens into the Atlantic. On one side, the familiar world: Egypt, Greece, Sicily, Italy, Phoenician ports, islands, trade routes, rival cities, colonies, temples, armies. On the other side, the great outer sea, a place of distance, uncertainty, storms, and possibility. Plato's priest tells Solon that Atlantis was an island beyond those pillars, in the Atlantic-facing ocean. And it was not described as a tiny lost island, or a lonely volcanic peak barely visible above the waves. It was enormous. In the Timaeus, Plato says Atlantis was larger than Libya and Asia combined. That line has launched 1,000 theories. People hear it and imagine a continent, a vanished landmass stretching across the Atlantic, a prehistoric superpower larger than anything in the ancient Mediterranean. But there is an important complication. When Plato says Libya, he does not mean the modern country of Libya. Greeks often used the term for much of North Africa west of Egypt. And when he says Asia, he does not mean the entire modern continent from Turkey to Japan. He generally means Asia Minor, roughly much of present-day Turkey. Even with that narrower ancient meaning, though, the scale is still staggering. Plato is not asking us to picture Crete. He is not describing Thera, modern Santorini, or some modest island kingdom lost in the Aegean. Atlantis is presented as something vastly larger, a major land beyond the Western Gate, a place with the resources, population, and strategic reach to threaten the Mediterranean world itself, and Plato gives it a capital worthy of that scale. At the centre of Atlantis stood a great city built around alternating rings of land and water. Picture it: a central island containing the royal palace and sacred sanctuary. Around it circular bands of sea, then rings of land. Then more water, more land, each zone connected by bridges and channels, creating a city arranged like a target, or perhaps a machine designed by a civilization that wanted nature itself to display its power. The Atlanteans cut a huge canal from the sea to the centre of the city, wide enough for ships to travel inward from the outer harbour. Their capital became both fortress and port, protected by water, connected to the ocean, filled with docks, shipyards, markets, temples, and military infrastructure. This is one reason Atlantis has remained so hard to let go of. Plato does not describe a vague dream world. He gives us engineering, measurements, harbours, walls, bridges, canals. He describes a plain carefully divided by waterways for irrigation and transport. He describes an immense ditch enclosing that plain. He describes a society able to organize labour on a scale that would challenge even powerful ancient kingdoms. And then there is the wealth. Atlantis had timber from forests, food from fertile land, animals in abundance, including elephants. Its rulers controlled metals, especially the mysterious substance Plato calls orichalcum, said to shine like fire. Whether orichalcum was a real metal, perhaps a kind of brass or a literary symbol of fabulous wealth, is still debated. But the point is clear: Atlantis had everything: natural resources, agricultural abundance, maritime access, monumental architecture, military power, a royal dynasty claiming descent from Poseidon himself. It was not merely rich, it was rich enough to become dangerous. According to Plato, the Atlanteans expanded outward from their island and conquered other territories. Their empire reached into parts of Libya as far as Egypt and into Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, usually understood as the region of western Italy associated with the Etruscans. That is an extraordinary claim, an Atlantic island empire crossing into the Mediterranean, dominating North Africa and Europe, and eventually colliding with ancient Athens. At this point, the geography begins to feel strange in a very specific way. Some of it is recognizable. Egypt is real. Athens is real. Libya, Tyrrhenia, the Mediterranean, the pillars of Heracles all belong to the Greek map of the world. But the scale is not recognizable. The political landscape is enlarged almost beyond belief. Plato takes known places and places them inside a conflict so ancient and so vast that ordinary history cannot reach it. It is like looking at a familiar map and realizing the borders have changed, the seas have opened, and a forgotten empire has appeared just beyond the horizon. So was Plato giving a literal location? That is the question that refuses to die. If Atlantis lay beyond Gibraltar, why has no trace of such a civilization been found in the Atlantic? No ruins of a massive capital, no inscriptions, no harbour works, no unmistakable material culture connecting a Western island empire to Egypt, Italy, Greece, and North Africa, thousands of years before Solon. There is no accepted archaeological evidence for Plato's Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean. And that matters. The Atlantic has been explored unevenly, and the seabed still holds mysteries. But a civilization on the scale Plato describes would not be expected to vanish without leaving any convincing evidence at all. An empire larger than Libya and Asia, with a colossal city, fleets, canals, temples, and continental conquests, should leave a deep archaeological footprint. So perhaps Beyond the Pillars is not a precise treasure map. Perhaps it is a symbol for Greeks. The pillars of Heracles marked a boundary. Beyond them was the outer ocean, the edge of the mapped world, the place where knowledge became speculation. By placing Atlantis there, Plato may be telling us that this was not just another rival state. It was the ultimate outside power, richer, larger, and more distant than anything Greece had faced. A civilization from beyond the known world, or perhaps the distance served another purpose. It made verification impossible. No Greek reader could simply sail west, find the ruins, and settle the question. Atlantis belonged to the realm where history, travel, rumour, myth, and philosophy could overlap. But Plato adds one final geographical detail, and it is one of the strangest in the entire story. Before Atlantis sank, he says, the ocean beyond the pillars was navigable. There were islands there, and beyond those islands, according to the account, one could reach a larger continent surrounding the true ocean. Then Atlantis was destroyed in a single day and night of calamity. Earthquakes and floods swallowed the island, and afterward the sea became impassable, blocked by mud and shoals left behind by the sunken land. This is difficult to reconcile with reality. The Atlantic is navigable. It was navigable in Plato's day. Greek and Phoenician sailors had travelled through Gibraltar and along Atlantic coasts. There is no known geological event in the Late Bronze Age, the Ice Age, or any other proposed period that turned the entire Atlantic beyond Gibraltar into an impassable mudbank created by a drowned continent. Some readers have suggested Plato was confused about ocean geography. Others think he was preserving distorted reports of shallow waters near coasts, sandbanks near the strait, or ancient seafaring limits. Still others see the detail as deliberate fiction, a way of sealing Atlantis off forever, making sure no one could reach it, because that is what the mud does in the story. It closes the door. Atlantis does not merely sink, it becomes inaccessible. The route to it is blocked, the evidence is buried. The world beyond the pillars becomes unreachable, and the greatest empire in the story is transformed into a warning no one can investigate. And maybe that is exactly the point. Atlantis is placed far enough away to be magnificent, powerful enough to be terrifying, and lost completely enough that only the Egyptians are said to remember it. But there is another part of Plato's map that is just as shocking, because Atlantis was not the only lost civilization in this story. Standing against it was an Athens far older, far greater, and far more mysterious than any Athens we know from history. And that is the twist hiding in plain sight. Atlantis is not the only civilization Plato asks us to believe has vanished. There is another lost world in the story, one much closer to home. Ancient Athens, in fact. Plato's account depends on this forgotten Athens just as much as it depends on Atlantis. The priest does not tell Solon that Atlantis attacked some unnamed collection of early Greeks. He says it faced Athens, an Athens supposedly existing 9,000 years before Solon, an Athens so old that even the Athenians themselves had forgotten it. And according to the Egyptian story, this ancient Athens did something almost impossible. It stood alone against the greatest empire on earth. In the Timaeus, the priest tells Solon that when Atlantis expanded into the Mediterranean, it conquered many peoples. It controlled lands in Europe and North Africa. Other Greek cities were threatened. Egypt was threatened, but Athens resisted. Not the Athens of Heracles. Not the city of the Parthenon, democracy, philosophers, and triremes. A vastly earlier Athens, a city already organized, already disciplined, already courageous enough to defeat an invading imperial power before being destroyed itself in the same sequence of cataclysms that swallowed Atlantis. That ancient Athens is not described in as much detail as Atlantis. Plato never gives it rings of canals, glittering palaces, or a giant Atlantic plain. But the details he does provide are revealing, because this is not merely an older Athens. It is Plato's ideal Athens. In the Timaeus, the priest says, the ancient Athenians had a social order resembling the one Solon had attempted to establish in his laws. In the Critias, Plato develops the idea further. The city had a class of guardians or warriors, separated from farmers and craftspeople. These defenders lived simply. They were trained for war. They possessed what they needed, but they did not chase luxury. They were not supposed to be rich, they were supposed to be good. Their society was organized around discipline, moderation, courage, and service to the whole community. Men and women alike are said to have shared in military training. The warrior class lived with common meals and limited private wealth. Their purpose was not to dominate other peoples. Their purpose was to protect their own city and defend Greece from aggression. If that sounds familiar, it should. This is extremely close to the political model Plato describes in the Republic. In the Republic, Plato imagines a just city governed by wisdom, defended by a guardian class, and protected from the corrupting effects of greed. The people best suited to rule do not rule because they want money. The warriors do not become merchants. Every group performs its proper role. The city is stable because its citizens are trained to value virtue over appetite. And in the Atlantis story, Plato gives that philosophical city a pass. He says, in effect, this was not only an idea. Once, long ago, Athens actually lived this way. That should make us cautious. The ancient Athens of the Timaeus and Critias may sound like historical testimony passed down from Egyptian priests, but it also fits Plato's own political and moral vision almost perfectly. Atlantis is a superpower swollen with wealth, expansion, and desire. Ancient Athens is its opposite, restrained, communal, brave, and just. One is empire, the other is order one takes, the other defends. But Plato does not only describe ancient Athens as morally different, he also describes it as physically different. According to Critias, the Attica of that remote age was far more fertile than the rocky landscape familiar to Plato's contemporaries. The soil was deeper. The hills were covered in forests. Rivers and springs flowed more reliably. The land could support a larger population and produce abundant food. Plato says Attica had been worn down over time by repeated floods and erosion. He compares the surviving land to the skeleton of a body wasted by disease. The rich soil had washed away, leaving behind the thin, stony ground people could see in his own day. It is a vivid image, and it is not completely disconnected from reality. Attica has experienced erosion for thousands of years. Deforestation, farming, grazing, fire, and changing rainfall patterns can strip soil from hillsides with remarkable speed. Ancient writers, including Plato, could see bare slopes, damaged watersheds, and declining agricultural land. They understood that landscapes change, but that does not confirm Plato's lost Athens. Erosion is real. Ancient environmental damage is real. Yet there is no geological evidence showing that Attica once supported the kind of immense prehistoric military state Plato describes, only to be erased almost completely around 9600 BCE. And archaeology creates an even bigger problem. If the 9,000-year figure is taken literally, the war between Athens and Atlantis happened roughly 9,600 years before Plato's time, around 9,600 BCE, that is deep in the early Holocene, just after the end of the last ice age. People did live in Greece then. Human communities had occupied the region for tens of thousands of years. But they lived in small hunter-gatherer groups and, later, early farming communities. Greece would eventually develop important Neolithic settlements. But there is no accepted archaeological evidence for a city-state in Attica at that date. No Acropolis fortress filled with trained guardians. No large army, no state bureaucracy, no monumental temples. No network of subject communities mobilized for a continental war against an Atlantic empire. The Athens of Plato's story is not what archaeology finds in Neolithic Greece. And this matters because it changes the Atlantis question. People often ask, where is Atlantis? But Plato's narrative makes a second claim that is equally extraordinary. Where is this ancient Athens? If Atlantis was real, then its opponent should also leave traces. A city capable of defeating a vast invading empire would be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in human history. Yet it has not appeared. That does not mean every detail in Plato's landscape description was invented from nothing. He may have drawn on real memories of erosion, old flood traditions, ancient ruins, Egyptian chronology, and the deep sense that civilizations can vanish. But the political shape of ancient Athens looks suspiciously perfect. Too perfect, perhaps, to be accidental. Atlantis is what happens when a gifted civilization becomes intoxicated by power. Ancient Athens is what Plato wanted Athens to be, a city that masters itself before trying to master others, a city where courage is stronger than wealth, a city that can resist an empire because it is not secretly becoming one. And that is why the next part of the story matters so much. Because Plato does not merely say Atlantis existed. He says Atlantis went to war, and the war, supposedly remembered only in Egypt, was the ultimate test of whether virtue could survive against overwhelming power. And according to Plato, virtue did survive, at least for a moment. The war begins when Atlantis stops being merely a rich island kingdom and becomes an expanding imperial power. In the Timaeus, the Egyptian priest tells Solon that the Atlanteans had assembled a vast force and attempted to enslave the peoples living inside the pillars of Heracles. In Greek terms, that means the lands of the Mediterranean world. The empire had already spread far beyond its original island. Plato says Atlantis ruled Libya as far as Egypt, and Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, usually understood as parts of Italy. Then it turned east, toward Greece, toward Athens, toward Egypt. This is not presented as a border dispute between neighbouring states. It is an invasion on a civilizational scale. Atlantis is described as powerful enough to threaten the entire Greek world and Egypt at once. Its rulers command armies, fleets, subject peoples, and immense resources drawn from lands they have conquered. The island's wealth has become military power, and military power has become a hunger for more wealth, more territory, more control. Then ancient Athens stands in its way. Plato's priest gives only a compressed account, but the outline is clear. Athens leads the Greeks in resistance. It confronts the invading Atlantean force. It wins, and in doing so it frees the peoples Atlantis had conquered or threatened. That is the official shape of the story. A gigantic empire comes from the west. A small, disciplined city resists it. The larger coalition collapses under pressure. Athens keeps fighting, and somehow, against impossible odds, Athens defeats the aggressor. If that sounds less like a record from 9,000 years before Solon, and more like a Greek patriotic memory, that is exactly the problem. Because Plato adds a crucial detail, ancient Athens did not simply lead a united Greek alliance to victory. The priest says that Athens was abandoned by its allies. Other Greek states withdrew. The Athenians were left to fight alone. Think about what Plato is asking us to picture. An enemy empire stretching across continents. A Greek coalition that loses its nerve. A single city that refuses to submit. Athens isolated, outnumbered, but morally stronger than everyone around it. Then Athens wins anyway. That is not just a war story. It is a political ideal turned into a national epic, and it carries unmistakable echoes of a conflict every educated Greek in Plato's world knew by heart, the Persian Wars. In 490 BCE, Athens helped defeat a Persian invasion at Marathon. 10 years later, the Persian king Xerxes returned with a far larger force. Greek cities argued, hesitated, made alliances, broke alliances, and faced the terrifying possibility of conquest. Athens was evacuated and burned. The Greek resistance survived. At Salamis, the Athenian navy played a decisive role in defeating the Persian fleet. Later victories pushed the invasion back. The details are not the same. Persia was not Atlantis. Marathon was not a prehistoric battle. Salamis was not fought by an Athens abandoned by every ally. But the emotional architecture is familiar. East versus West, although Atlantis bizarrely comes from the West. Freedom versus imperial domination. A smaller Greek force against a massive invading empire. Athens as the city that bears the greatest burden. And victory not because Athens is richer, but because it is braver, more disciplined and more committed to freedom. Plato was writing in a world shaped by the memory of those wars. The Persian invasions had become part of Greek identity. They were proof that a free city could defeat a vastly more powerful monarchy. They were also, especially for Athenians, proof that Athens had saved Greece. The Atlantis War takes that memory and pushes it into deep time. It makes Athens not merely the saviour of Greece in the 5th century BCE, but the saviour of Greece before Greece even existed. And notice the contrast Plato builds. Atlantis has ships, gold, territory, population, and imperial reach. Ancient Athens has virtue. It has order. It has citizens trained to put the common good above private gain. This is Plato's political philosophy in military form. The Atlanteans lose because they become corrupted by prosperity. They forget their divine inheritance, become greedy, and turn toward conquest. The Athenians win because they remain self-controlled. They are not driven by luxury. They do not seek empire. They fight only when forced to defend freedom. It is the oldest and most powerful kind of political story, the righteous underdog defeating the decadent superpower. But if this was a real war of the scale Plato describes, where is the evidence? There is no known Egyptian inscription describing an Atlantic empire invading Egypt and Greece around 9600 BCE. Egyptian writing itself does not appear until thousands of years later in the late 4th millennium BCE. That does not prove Egyptians could not have preserved older traditions orally, through sacred genealogies, king lists, or lost records. But it does mean there is no surviving Egyptian document that independently confirms Solon's story. There is no Greek tradition outside Plato that remembers this ancient Athenian victory. No surviving epic, no temple inscription, no local cult clearly tied to a war against Atlantis, no list of kings, generals, battlefields, or fallen heroes. And archaeology does not reveal the physical footprint we would expect from such a conflict. A war involving a vast Atlantic empire, an organised Athenian state, Greek allies, Egyptian territory, fleets, invasions, and mass destruction should leave something. Fortifications, weapons, settlements, graves, burned layers, trade disruptions, political changes visible across multiple regions. Instead, around 9600 BCE, the Mediterranean world was inhabited by small communities living through the dramatic environmental changes of the early Holocene. There were no known states in Greece or Egypt, no cities capable of organising continental warfare, no evidence for the kind of empire Plato describes. That does not mean Plato invented every ingredient from nothing. Stories can preserve fragments, a memory of ancient flooding, a tale of land lost to the sea, a warning about foreign invasion, a distant echo of conflicts from later Bronze Age or Archaic periods. Human memory does not always preserve dates accurately, but it can preserve fears with extraordinary power. Still, the war, as Plato tells it, is not confirmed history. And there is another clue. The story is almost too perfectly arranged. Atlantis is everything Plato distrusts. Wealth without restraint, power without justice, expansion without moral limits. Ancient Athens is everything Plato admires. Disciplined guardians, common purpose, moderation, courage, and resistance to tyranny. One city is corrupted by appetite, the other is governed by reason. One becomes an empire, the other saves the free world. That does not make the story meaningless. In some ways it makes it more meaningful. Plato may not be giving us a modern historical report. He may be doing something more ambitious, using the authority of Egypt, the prestige of deep antiquity, and the emotional memory of the Persian Wars to create a political myth. A myth is not necessarily a lie. It can be a framework for thinking. A story designed to tell a society what it fears, what it values, and what it might become. The war against Atlantis asks a brutal question. What actually defeats a powerful civilization? Is it a stronger army, a larger empire? Or is it the moment that civilization becomes unable to control its own greed? And that question leads directly to the strangest feature of Plato's tale. Why does this warning need to come from Egypt at all? Because Egypt gave Plato something Athens could never give itself: distance, authority, and the unsettling power of being judged by someone older. To a Greek audience, Egypt was not just another foreign country. It was the ancient country, a land of temples, tombs, priesthoods, monumental stone buildings, sacred rituals, astronomical observations, and records that seemed to reach back beyond the limits of Greek memory. Greek cities had traditions. They had poems, genealogies, temple inscriptions, lists of magistrates, stories of kings and heroes. But compared with Egypt, Greece often appeared young, fragmented, restless. A world of competing city-states constantly making, losing, and remaking its past. Egypt looked different. The pyramids were already ancient when Plato was alive. The great temples had been expanded and rebuilt by generations of kings whose names disappeared into a past almost too deep to imagine. The Nile flooded with remarkable regularity. Dynasties rose and fell. Foreign rulers came and went. But the image of Egypt was continuity, a civilization that had been watching while everyone else was still learning how to remember. And Greeks were fascinated by that. Herodotus, writing roughly a century before Plato, filled his account of Egypt with priests, monuments, customs, and stories of enormous antiquity. He describes Egyptian priests, showing him statues of high priests from generation after generation, using them as evidence for a past that stretched far beyond Greek traditions. Whether every claim Herodotus reports was accurate is another question. He openly tells readers what he heard, what he saw, and what he could not verify. But the important point is that Egypt had become, in Greek imagination, a kind of archive of the ancient world. If you wanted a story to sound old, really old, you sent a Greek traveller to Egypt. If you wanted religious wisdom, Egypt had priests. If you wanted mathematical knowledge, astronomy, sacred calendars, or forgotten catastrophes, Egypt had temples full of records. And if you wanted to tell Athens an uncomfortable truth, Egypt gave you someone who could say it. That is exactly what happens in the Timaeus. The Egyptian priest does not flatter Solon. He rebukes him. "You Greeks are always children," he says in the famous passage, or something very close to that depending on the translation. "You have no ancient beliefs, no deep memory, no old knowledge preserved from the beginning." Imagine how that would have landed with Plato's audience. Athens was proud of its culture, its drama, philosophy, architecture, democracy, naval power, and military victories. Even after the disasters of the Peloponnesian War, Athenians knew they belonged to one of the most brilliant societies in the Greek world. Then Plato introduces an Egyptian priest who effectively says, "Brilliant, perhaps. Ancient? No. You think your city understands history? You barely remember your own past. You think Athens is wise? Egypt has forgotten more than Athens has ever known." That does not mean Plato was simply repeating Egyptian ideas. The story is written in Greek, Its political structure is deeply Platonic. Ancient Athens looks remarkably like Plato's ideal city, with its disciplined warrior class, limited wealth, common purpose, and resistance to luxury. Atlantis looks like the nightmare version of a wealthy imperial power. But Plato does not place this judgment in the mouth of Socrates. He does not have an Athenian elder announce that Athens has become corrupt, forgetful, and obsessed with power. That would be too direct. Instead, he lets a foreign priest say it. And that changes everything. A criticism spoken from inside Athens can sound like factional politics. One citizen attacking another, a philosopher complaining about democracy. But a criticism delivered by an Egyptian priest arrives with the force of an outside verdict. Egypt is not competing with Athens for an election. It is not asking Athenians to join one political faction against another. It stands beyond the quarrel, or at least appears to. It is the ancient witness, the keeper of the long memory. The civilization that has seen cities rise, become proud, and vanish. That is why the Egyptian setting matters so much. It gives the Atlantis story the appearance of independence. The tale does not supposedly begin with Plato. It does not even begin with Athens. It comes from Solon, the revered Athenian lawgiver. Solon heard it from priests at Sais. Those priests consulted temple records, and those records preserved the memory of events that Greeks had forgotten. That is an impressive chain. Plato, Critias, his grandfather also named Critias, Dropides, Solon, Egyptian priests, sacred records. Each step pushes the story farther away from the author and deeper into the past. It creates the feeling that Plato is not inventing a political myth. He is receiving one, but that feeling is not the same as proof. This is where literary authority can resemble historical sourcing without actually being historical sourcing. Plato gives names, places, a famous lawgiver, a specific Egyptian city, a goddess shared, he says, by both peoples, Neith in Egypt, Athena in Greece. He describes priests and inscriptions and ancestral records. These details make the story feel grounded. They make it sound like the kind of account a serious investigator might trace. But no Egyptian text has been found that tells the Atlantis story. No surviving record confirms that Solon visited Sais and received this account. Ancient sources do connect Solon with travel, including possible travel to Egypt, but the specific conversation with a priest comes from Plato, and that distinction matters. A story can use real places and plausible institutions without becoming a verified historical report. Historical novels do it, political speeches do it. Even modern conspiracy theories do it. Add dates, documents, experts, old archives, foreign witnesses, and suddenly an argument feels stronger than the evidence beneath it. Plato was a master of that kind of construction, not necessarily because he wanted to deceive his readers in the modern sense. His audience understood that philosophical writing could use myths, speeches, invented conversations, and dramatic settings to explore truths that were not simple chronicle. But Plato also knew that authority matters. A warning from ancient Egypt carries a different weight than a warning from an Athenian philosopher. And Egypt does something else for him. It lets Athens see itself from the outside. From the Egyptian priest's perspective, Greek civilization is vulnerable to amnesia. Floods and fires destroy communities. Survivors lose writing, law, memory, and history. Then they begin again, believing they are the first people who ever mattered. That is not only a story about physical disaster, it is a story about intellectual arrogance. A society that remembers only itself may mistake its brief moment of success for permanent wisdom. It may think wealth means virtue, power means justice, expansion means greatness. Egypt in Plato's story is there to remind Greece that none of those things last. And once that ancient voice has established the warning, Plato can turn the question back toward Athens. What happens when a city becomes rich enough to believe it cannot fail? That question sits at the center of Atlantis. What happens when a city becomes rich enough to believe it cannot fail? Plato's answer is not subtle. It becomes Atlantis. In the Critias, Atlantis does not begin as a civilization of monsters or tyrants. It begins with a divine inheritance. The god Poseidon receives the island as his portion of the world, and fathers children there with a mortal woman named Plato. Their descendants become the rulers of Atlantis. The largest share goes to Atlas, the firstborn whose name becomes attached to the island, the people, and eventually the ocean beyond. For generations, Plato says, these rulers govern well. They obey the laws handed down by Poseidon. They respect the divine element in themselves. They are wealthy, powerful, and technologically impressive, but wealth has not yet mastered them. That detail is crucial. Plato is not saying that prosperity automatically corrupts a society. Atlantis is prosperous almost from the beginning. Its plain is fertile. Its natural resources are abundant. It has forests, animals, metals, harbours, canals, shipyards, palaces, temples, and an enormous capital arranged in rings of land and water. The famous image of Atlantis is not primitive. It is dazzling. It is a world of engineering, trade, military organisation, and spectacular material abundance. In other words, it has everything a powerful civilization might point to as proof of its greatness. And that is exactly the danger, because over time the rulers of Atlantis change. Or rather, the balance inside them changes. Plato says the divine part of their nature becomes weaker, diluted by repeated mixture with mortal humanity. Their human traits take control. They become obsessed with possessions, honour, and domination. They can no longer bear their good fortune with moderation. Think about that phrase, they cannot bear good fortune. Most people imagine decline as something caused by failure. Defeat in war, crop shortages, political chaos, economic collapse. But Plato's warning is more unsettling. A society can be destroyed by success, long before an enemy reaches its walls. The Atlanteans have become too rich to remain disciplined, too powerful to remain restrained, too convinced of their own superiority to recognize the difference between strength and justice. And then they look outward. Atlantis expands beyond its island domain. It assembles an immense military force and attempts to conquer the lands inside the Mediterranean world. In Plato's account, it is not simply defending itself or seeking trade. It is pursuing empire. It wants to bring other peoples under its rule. This is where ancient Athens enters the story. Not the Athens of Plato's day. Not the crowded, argumentative maritime democracy that had built an empire of its own. Plato gives us a much older Athens, supposedly existing 9,000 years before Solon. And this ancient Athens is almost suspiciously close to Plato's political ideals. Its guardians are disciplined. They live simply. They do not hoard private wealth. They are trained for courage, self-control, and the common good. Their city is organized around virtue rather than luxury, around service rather than personal ambition. Atlantis has gold, fleets, palaces, exotic materials, and an empire. Ancient Athens has discipline. Atlantis has Sais. Athens has courage. Atlantis has every external advantage a state could want. Athens has the one advantage Plato thinks matters most, a political order capable of producing citizens who are not ruled by appetite. And against all expectation, this smaller, virtuous Athens stands against the Atlantean invasion. Plato says it fights on behalf of the peoples threatened by Atlantis. even when its allies abandon it, Athens holds its ground and defeats the imperial power. It is hard to miss the political contrast. Atlantis looks like a warning about imperial ambition, luxury, naval power, and the moral intoxication of a state that has become too successful. For Plato's Athenian audience, that would have had uncomfortable echoes. Athens itself had once commanded an empire across the Aegean. It had demanded tribute from allies, built magnificent monuments, pursued distant campaigns, and eventually suffered catastrophic defeat in the Peloponnesian War. Plato never simply says, Atlantis is Athens. The comparison is more complicated than that. But the story invites the question, when a democracy becomes wealthy, expansionist, and hungry for prestige, what keeps power from becoming greed? What stops a city from confusing conquest with greatness? This is why Atlantis belongs so naturally beside Plato's larger philosophical concerns. In the Republic, he asks what justice looks like in a person and a city. In other dialogues, he repeatedly returns to the instability of political life, the seductions of wealth, the weakness of leaders driven by appetite, anger, or ambition. A state, like an individual, can have a soul out of balance. Atlantis is that imbalance made geographic, a whole civilization with no inner restraint. But there is one major complication. The Critias is unfinished. The dialogue breaks off at the very moment when Zeus, king of the gods, gathers the other gods to judge Atlantis. Plato tells us that Zeus sees the corruption clearly. He prepares to speak, and then the text ends. We do not have the speech. We do not know precisely what judgment Plato intended to deliver. Perhaps he planned a divine condemnation, perhaps a final political lesson. Perhaps the destruction of Atlantis by earthquakes and floods would have followed immediately. The Timaeus already tells us that both armies were later swallowed by catastrophe in a single day and night. But Critias never completes the dramatic path to that ending. That incompleteness limits certainty. We can see Plato building a moral pattern. Virtue, prosperity, corruption, imperial aggression, judgment. But we cannot recover every detail of the conclusion he intended. And that brings us back to the 9,000 years. Why place this warning so far beyond ordinary history? Maybe Plato believed he was preserving an authentic Egyptian tradition. Maybe elements of older stories, Greek political memory, and philosophical invention were woven together. We cannot prove exactly how he understood every part of the tale. But the immense date does something powerful whether or not it is historical. It removes Atlantis from the realm of ordinary political argument. This is not just one Greek city criticizing another after a recent war. It is a warning projected into deep time. An empire rises. It becomes magnificent, it loses its moral center. It reaches for everything, and then it disappears so completely that later civilizations barely remember it existed. 9,000 years makes the message feel less like a local event and more like a law of history. Power without virtue does not become secure, it becomes dangerous. And a civilization can possess extraordinary wealth, knowledge, and force, yet still be moving toward ruin. But a powerful warning is not the same thing as a historical record, and this is where the Atlantis mystery runs into its hardest problem. If Egyptian priests really told Solon about Atlantis, if they described a war between ancient Athens and a vast empire 9,000 years before his time, if they claimed their temples had preserved the memory through catastrophes that erased Greek history, then we should ask the most basic question possible. Where is the Egyptian evidence? Not where is the evidence people wish existed. Not where is the missing scroll that might someday turn up. Where is the evidence we actually have? So far, no known Egyptian inscription identifies Atlantis. No surviving papyrus describes an island empire beyond the pillars of Heracles. No temple text records its war against Athens, and no Egyptian document mentions Solon receiving this story from priests at Sais. That does not prove Plato invented every part of it from nothing. History almost never gives us proof that clean, but it does set a limit. The Egyptian origin story of Atlantis is known to us through Plato, not through Egypt. That distinction matters. Imagine someone tells you there is a lost royal archive containing the history of an unknown superpower. You would not reject the possibility merely because the archive has not been found. Archives disappear, buildings burn, papyrus rots, stone gets reused in later construction, tomb robbers tear apart burial chambers, cities are abandoned, flooded, buried under sand, or built over by later cities. Ancient Egypt preserved an astonishing amount, but it did not preserve everything. In fact, most of what ancient Egyptians wrote is gone. This is easy to forget because Egypt gives us pyramids, temples, mummies, obelisks, and inscriptions carved into stone. It can feel like a civilization speaking directly across 5,000 years. But the surviving record is still fragmentary. For every text preserved in a tomb or temple, there may have been countless letters, tax rolls, maps, religious documents, local histories and administrative records that simply decayed. And Sais itself makes the point especially clear. The city was important. It became the capital of Egypt during the 26th dynasty, the site period close to Solon's lifetime. Its patron goddess Neith had a famous temple. Greek visitors did travel in Egypt during this era. So Plato's setting is not random. A conversation between Greeks and Egyptian priests is historically plausible in the broadest sense. But the temple archives of Sais have not survived. That means absence is not always simple proof of absence. We cannot say no surviving Zaiti document mentions Atlantis. Therefore, no priest at Sais ever told a story resembling Plato's. That goes beyond what the evidence can establish. But now comes the other side of the problem. The larger the claim, the more evidence we should expect. A minor local legend could vanish almost without a trace. A story told orally by a priest, never written down, could disappear when the people who knew it died. A misunderstood Egyptian date, a tale of an old flood, a name translated badly by a Greek traveller. Any of those are possible in principle. Atlantis is not a minor local legend. Plato describes an enormous island realm with vast resources, elaborate engineering, major naval power, colonies and territories, and an army capable of threatening lands throughout the Mediterranean. He places its destruction around the 10th millennium BCE, and he pairs it with an ancient Athenian state supposedly organized enough to resist this imperial assault. That is a claim on a completely different scale. Around 9,600 BCE, Egypt itself was not yet the kingdom of pharaohs. The pyramids were still thousands of years in the future. Writing had not appeared in Egypt. The Nile Valley contained human communities adapting to the end of the last ice age, not a centralized civilization leaving royal annals in temples. The same is true in Greece. There is no evidence for a 10th millennium BCE Athenian state. No palaces, no fortifications, no bureaucracy, no writing, no army organized on the scale Plato requires. Athens as a city did not exist. The Acropolis was inhabited long before classical Athens, yes, but that is not remotely the same as a fully formed state defeating a transoceanic empire. And there is no archaeological evidence for that empire either. No identifiable Atlantean ports, no distinctive writing system spreading across the Atlantic and Mediterranean, no trade network linking a lost oceanic superpower to Egypt, Greece, North Africa, Iberia, or the Near East. No sudden layer of weapons, destruction, or foreign material pointing to a war of that scale. Could archaeology be incomplete? Absolutely. Could coastlines now underwater conceal settlements from the end of the Ice Age? Yes. Sea levels rose dramatically after the last glacial maximum, drowning enormous areas of former coastal landscape. There are real prehistoric sites waiting beneath modern seas. There are still regions of Egypt, Greece, and the Mediterranean that have barely been investigated. Those are legitimate unanswered questions. But an unanswered question is not evidence for Atlantis. This is where the mystery often goes wrong. People begin with a real gap in the record, then fill that gap with the largest possible story. We do not know every settlement that existed near ancient coastlines, therefore there may have been Atlantis. We have lost Egyptian archives, therefore the priest's account may be true. We have evidence of ancient floods. Therefore, Plato's catastrophe must preserve the memory of a drowned empire. Each step sounds reasonable by itself. Put them together, and they become a ladder built mostly from possibility. Possibility is not proof. The evidence does support something more restrained, and in its own way more interesting. Egypt had deep traditions of sacred history. Egyptian priests could claim access to records and memories older than Greek civic history. Greek visitors could be impressed by Egyptian antiquity. Plato could use that authority to make his story feel ancient, foreign, and difficult to dismiss. But Egyptology does not independently confirm Atlantis. It does not confirm the war. It does not confirm the 9,000-year date. And it does not confirm that Solon ever heard the story at Sais. That does not end the investigation. It tells us where the investigation has to begin, not with the question, how can we prove Atlantis was real, but with a better question. What kinds of real memories, real disasters, real Egyptian traditions, and real Greek anxieties could have been transformed into a story this powerful? That question opens a different path through the Atlantis mystery. Maybe Plato's story is not a report of one lost empire. Maybe it is a structure built from real kinds of catastrophe. Real cities buried, real coastlines drowned, real societies shattered by events so violent that they survived for centuries as stories. And the most famous candidate begins with an island exploding in the Aegean. Around the 17th century BCE, the volcanic island of Thera, modern Santorini, produced one of the largest eruptions of the last several thousand years. Before the eruption, Thera was home to Akrotiri, a remarkably sophisticated Bronze Age settlement. Multi-story buildings, painted walls, storerooms, drainage systems, evidence of trade reaching across the Aegean and beyond. Then the island began to tear itself apart. Earthquakes struck first. The inhabitants of Akrotiri seem to have had enough warning to leave, because archaeologists have found surprisingly few human remains beneath the ash. But the city itself was buried. Streets vanished, houses filled. An entire community was sealed beneath volcanic debris, preserved in silence for more than 3,000 years. Then came the eruption. Ash rose high into the atmosphere. Parts of the island collapsed into the sea. Tsunamis likely struck nearby coasts. The Aegean trading world was disrupted at exactly the moment when the Minoan civilization of Crete was one of the great powers of the eastern Mediterranean. It is easy to see why people connect this to Atlantis. An advanced island society, a maritime power, a catastrophe involving earthquakes, fire, and the sea. A place swallowed, at least in part, by a volcanic caldera. Even the circular shape of Santorini has reminded people of Plato's concentric rings. For more than a century, Thera has been the most persuasive real-world setting proposed for Atlantis. But persuasive is not the same as proven. Plato places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles, usually understood by Greeks as the Strait of Gibraltar. Thera lies deep inside the Aegean, hundreds of miles in the opposite direction. Plato's Atlantis is described as enormous, larger than Libya and Asia combined in the text's famously difficult geography. Thera is small, and the dates do not line up. The eruption happened roughly 1,600 years before Plato's time, depending on the chronology used. Plato's Egyptian priests claim 9,000 years. That is not a minor mismatch. It is the difference between the Bronze Age and the end of the Ice Age. There is another problem. The eruption did not simply erase the Minoan world overnight. Crete remained inhabited. Minoan culture continued, though under increasing pressure and eventually overshadowed by Mycenaean Greek power. A disaster can weaken a civilization without being the sole cause of its fall. History is usually messier than a single giant wave. Still, imagine the memory. Sailors telling stories of an island that thundered like a god, traders seeing ash darken the sky, coastal villages watching the sea withdraw, then return as a wall of water. Generations later, the details would blur. The date would blur. The geography would blur, but the emotional core could remain. A rich island, a proud sea power, a day when the earth broke open and the sea took it. That is not Atlantis, but it is exactly the kind of event from which an Atlantis-like story can grow. And Thera was not the only real catastrophe available to the ancient imagination. Go back much farther to the end of the last ice age. Around 20,000 years ago, so much water was locked in glaciers that sea level stood more than 100 meters lower than it does today. Coastlines were radically different. Broad plains connected lands now divided by water. River valleys extended far beyond today's shores. Places where people hunted, gathered shellfish, built camps, and buried their dead now lie beneath the sea. Then the ice melted, not in one single global flood, not all at once, but over thousands of years oceans rose by more than 120 meters. In some places the change was slow enough to unfold across many generations. In others, storms, local subsidence, shifting river channels, and sudden coastal breaches made the loss feel immediate. Picture a community living near a low coastal plain. Their grandparents remember dry land beyond the horizon. Their parents move inland as the shoreline creeps closer. Their children watch familiar hunting grounds become marsh. Their grandchildren see them disappear beneath the water. That kind of experience does not require a lost super-civilization to become unforgettable. It requires only people who live near coasts. People who tell their children where the old river used to run. People who remember a hill that became an island. People who pass down the warning that the sea was once farther away, and that it can always come back. Flood myths appear in many cultures for a reason. Rivers flood. Tsunamis strike. Coasts drown. Human beings are drawn to water because water gives food, travel, fertile soil, and trade. But the places most valuable to live are often the places most vulnerable to disaster. There are other proposed settings for Atlantis too. Some point west, toward Iberia and the Atlantic coast. The region around southern Spain and Portugal contains ancient settlements, old river systems, and low-lying landscapes repeatedly reshaped by flooding and changing sea levels. Others look farther into the Atlantic, toward the Azores, the Canary Islands, or submerged landscapes near the continental shelf. But the Atlantic proposals face a basic geological problem. There is no evidence that a large continent or Bronze Age-style island empire sank beneath the central Atlantic in human history. Islands can collapse, volcanoes can erupt, coastlines can change. But that is very different from an entire continent vanishing beneath the ocean. Others look east instead. Anatolia, with its ancient cities, earthquakes, and long human history. The Black Sea region, where some researchers have proposed dramatic flooding after the Ice Age, though the scale and speed of that event remain debated. Even places in North Africa and the Western Mediterranean have been proposed, usually because one feature seems to fit: a plain, a flood, a ruined port, an old place name, a nearby volcano. And this is where we need to slow down. Atlantis is a machine for generating resemblance. Find an island destroyed by eruption, and it feels like Thera. Find drowned coastal land, and it feels like Atlantis. Find an ancient city with canals, and it feels like Atlantis. Find a powerful maritime culture that declined, and it feels like Atlantis. But one matching feature does not identify the whole story. A volcanic eruption does not prove Plato's Atlantic Empire. A drowned shoreline does not prove the war with ancient Athens. A circular harbour does not prove Egyptian records reaching back 9,000 years. Similarity can be meaningful. It can point us toward the real disasters that fed human memory. But it can also mislead us, because Plato's story contains enough dramatic elements for almost any lost place to fit part of the pattern. Maybe that is the answer hiding in plain sight. Atlantis may not be the memory of one catastrophe. It may be a legendary memory made from many catastrophes. Maybe that is the answer hiding in plain sight. Atlantis may not be the memory of one catastrophe. It may be a legendary memory made from many catastrophes. And that brings us back to the number that started this entire investigation. 9,000 years. What are we supposed to do with it? There are 4 major ways to read the warning the Egyptian priest gives Solon, and each one reveals something different about why this story has survived for more than 2,300 years. The first reading is the most dramatic. Take the account literally. Egyptian priests preserved records from 9,000 years before Solon. Ancient Athens really existed in the deep past. Atlantis was a powerful island empire beyond the pillars of Heracles. It attacked the Mediterranean world, was defeated, and then vanished in earthquakes and floods. It is an extraordinary possibility, but extraordinary possibilities need extraordinary evidence. So far, archaeology has not found the enormous Atlantic civilization Plato describes. No confirmed Egyptian text records the Atlantean War. No ruins, inscriptions, trade networks, or material remains point clearly to a kingdom matching the story. That does not prove every ancient tradition is false. It means the literal reading remains unverified. The second reading is more cautious. Atlantis may contain distorted historical memory, not one lost continent, not one perfectly preserved record, but fragments. Memories of drowned coastlines after the Ice Age. Memories of tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, failed harvests, and cities destroyed by war. Over centuries, perhaps millennia, separate events could merge into one enormous story. Dates grow larger, locations move, real enemies become symbolic enemies. A disaster affecting one island becomes a disaster affecting the world. This is how human memory often works. We preserve the emotional truth long after the factual map has been lost. The sea came. The earth shook. A powerful people fell because they believed they could not fall. The third reading focuses on Egypt itself. Plato may have drawn on a real Greek fascination with Egyptian antiquity. To Greeks of the classical period, Egypt was ancient in a way Greece was not. Its temples, monuments, priesthoods, king lists, rituals, and written records seem to reach back into unimaginable time. So when Plato wanted to tell a story about civilizations older than Greece remembered, where else would he place the source? Egypt gave the story authority, not necessarily because a priest at Sais truly handed Solon a 9,000-year-old archive, but because Egypt represented deep time, sacred knowledge, and the terrifying possibility that Greece's proud history was only a recent chapter in a much older human story. And then there is the fourth reading. Atlantis is Platonic fiction. Not fiction in the sense of meaningless invention. Plato was not just making things up for fun. He was building a philosophical experiment. He creates a superpower rich beyond measure, militarily unstoppable, technologically impressive, and morally rotten. Then he pits it against an idealized ancient Athens, a city defined not by wealth, but by discipline, courage, and civic virtue. Atlantis is not merely a place. It is a warning about what power becomes when it stops answering to restraint. Under this reading, asking where Atlantis sank may be like asking where Shakespeare's Prospero ruled. The question is interesting, but it can distract from the point of the story, because the point is not only that cities can vanish, the point is that civilizations can forget. Remember the priest's rebuke to Solon. The Greeks, he says, are always children, not because they lack intelligence, because disasters repeatedly destroy human memory. Fire, flood, war, collapse. Each time, survivors begin again with little more than the basics. Writing disappears, archives vanish, institutions break apart. And the people who come after mistake the small surviving slice of the past for the whole of history. That warning does not require Atlantis to be real. It is real enough already. Modern societies have libraries, satellites, digital archives, global communications, and scientific institutions. We know more about the deep past than any previous civilization. But knowledge is not the same thing as wisdom. A society can possess vast information and still be fragile. It can understand environmental danger and delay action. It can celebrate its power while weakening the systems that keep it alive. It can forget, not because the records are gone, but because nobody wants to read them. That is what makes Atlantis feel uncomfortably modern. Environmental fragility. A wealthy society dependent on systems it does not fully control. Political arrogance. Leaders and citizens convinced that success proves they are invulnerable. Cultural amnesia. The belief that the present order is natural, permanent, and somehow exempt from the fate of everyone who came before. Plato's imaginary island sinks in a single terrible day and night. Real decline is usually slower. A coastline erodes. A harvest fails, institutions lose trust, inequality hardens. Warnings become background noise. Then, when the crisis finally arrives, people call it unexpected because they had spent years refusing to see it. So how should we read the 9,000-year warning today? With imagination, but also discipline. We should be open to the possibility that ancient stories preserve echoes of real disasters. We should take seriously the fact that human memory can reach farther than written history, especially through myth, ritual, and inherited fear. But mystery is not a license to ignore evidence. A compelling story is not the same as a confirmed past. Atlantis does not need to be a sunken continent to matter. It matters because it asks a question every civilization eventually has to face. What do we lose when we become so confident in our own age that we can no longer imagine being forgotten? So, after all the arguments, all the theories, all the maps with red circles drawn across the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, Antarctica, the Caribbean, Spain, Morocco, and places no Bronze Age ship could possibly have reached, what did the priests really tell Solon? The strongest answer is also the simplest. In Plato's account, an elderly Egyptian priest tells Solon that Athens once existed in a far older and more heroic form. That ancient Athens, the priest says, stood against a vast power called Atlantis. And the war happened 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt. That is what the text says. Not 900 years. Not vaguely long ago. Not in the age of the pyramids or the Bronze Age. Plato gives the number plainly, 9,000 years. If Solon visited Egypt around the early 6th century BC, that pushes the war back to roughly 9,600 BC, before cities, before writing as far as current archaeological evidence shows, before metalworking kingdoms, palaces, and the kinds of institutions needed to build the enormous empire Plato describes. And that is exactly why the number has caused so much trouble. It is too specific to ignore, too large to fit easily into conventional ancient history, and too deeply woven into the story to dismiss without asking why Plato included it in the first place. But there is a second part to the answer, and it matters just as much. We do not have the Egyptian priest's words. We do not have Solon's Egyptian notebook. We do not have a temple inscription from Sais naming Atlantis. We do not have a surviving papyrus recording a war between ancient Athens and an island empire beyond the Pillars of Heracles. What we have is Plato writing, probably around 2 centuries after Solon lived. Plato presenting the story through a chain of transmission, Egyptian priests to Solon, Solon to his family, then through Dropides and Critias, until finally it reaches Plato's dialogue. That does not make the story worthless, but it tells us what kind of evidence we are dealing with. This is not an independently verified Egyptian archive that modern historians can inspect line by line. It is a literary account written by one of history's greatest philosophers, an account designed to make us think about time, memory, political power, catastrophe, and the fate of civilizations. Historical possibility is not proof. The fact that Solon may genuinely have travelled to Egypt does not prove he heard the Atlantis story there. The fact that Egyptian priests kept records and preserved traditions does not prove they possessed a 9,000-year chronicle of ancient Athens. The fact that floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and drowned landscapes are real does not prove they all point to one lost empire. And yet, imaginative certainty is not the same thing as understanding either. We should not pretend the mystery disappears just because the evidence is incomplete. Ancient people did preserve memories in ways that surprise us. Oral traditions can carry the shadow of disasters across generations. Temples could preserve genealogies, rituals, king lists, and sacred histories for centuries. Egypt really did represent deep antiquity to the Greeks. A visit to Sais, to the temple of Neith, could easily have convinced a statesman like Solon that Greece remembered only a fraction of humanity's past. That atmosphere is important. Egypt gives Plato's story authority because Egypt stands for memory. Not perfect memory necessarily, not a magical vault containing every lost fact, but memory on a scale that made Greek history seem young. Then Plato adds catastrophe, fire from the sky, flood from the sea, repeated destructions that erase cities, writing, and history itself. The priest's rebuke is not simply that Greeks are ignorant. It is that every civilization may be ignorant of what came before it, because the past is fragile. Then Plato adds chronology. 9,000 years is not just a date. It is a psychological weapon. It forces Solon and us to stare into a depth of time so vast that ordinary history begins to feel small. Greece, proud of its heroes and city-states, becomes the child of a much older world. Then he adds ancient Athens, not the real historical Athens of Heracles, ships, markets, philosophers, and democratic assemblies. An ideal Athens, poorer, harder, more disciplined. A city that wins not through luxury or empire, but through courage and virtue. And finally, he gives that ideal city an enemy, Atlantis. Rich, powerful, expansive, brilliant, blessed with natural resources and terrifying military strength, but consumed by greed, pride, and the belief that power has no limits. That is why Egypt, catastrophe, chronology, ancient Athens and Atlantis belong together. Remove one piece, and the story loses its force. Egypt gives it ancient authority. Catastrophe explains forgotten history. The 9,000-year number creates deep time. Ancient Athens provides the moral contrast. Atlantis becomes the warning. So what did the priests really tell Solon? Maybe Plato believed they told him something like this. Maybe he inherited a real tradition and transformed it. Maybe he used Egypt as the perfect setting for a philosophical story. Maybe the story contains fragments of older memories, reshaped beyond recognition. Or maybe Atlantis was always meant to be read less as a place on a map than as a mirror held up to every powerful society. The honest answer is that we do not know, and that uncertainty is not a failure of the investigation. It is the boundary between evidence and imagination. On one side, we have Plato's text, the historical reality of Egypt's prestige, and the undeniable fact that civilizations can be destroyed and forgotten. On the other, we have claims that go far beyond what archaeology, inscriptions, and surviving records can currently support. The mystery survives because that boundary is still there. What do you think the 9,000-year number means? A literal date? A mistranslated calendar? A distorted memory of real disasters? Or Plato's way of making his warning impossible to ignore? Let me know in the comments and tell us where you're listening from. If you enjoyed this journey into Atlantis, please like, comment and subscribe. And if you want to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify. The link is in the description.